Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. This is my first and likely only time sharing something here. I'm not sure what compels me, but I have a story that needs to be told, and everyone else I've tried to share it with has left me feeling alienated. My department has me on a mental well-being break clinical talk for suspended until you get your act together to counselors have suggested I have PTSD, but I know that isn't the case. My wife thinks I'm being obsessive and losing touch, so she's gone to stay with her mom. And based on the manila envelope the post office says is on the way, I'm likely facing divorce papers soon. So here I am, writing down what sounds like absolute lunacy, while keeping an eye on my surroundings because, in a day or two, I might not be able to share this story again. I don't blame my wife. I love her deeply, and I know she shares that sentiment. But when someone you love refuses to engage with what you believe would help, what choice is left? The things I've ranted about would seem delusional and dangerous if I hadn't witnessed them personally. I don't blame the department. It would be irresponsible to have me out on the streets given the things I've claimed. But they just aren't seeing what I am. I don't blame the two counselors. I've spoken with one from the department and the other from the VA. I have a body of work that supports their diagnosis. The truth is, I know something horrible is loose in Hilux County, and I'm scared it may be beyond my capability to handle. Hilux County has been my home for 26 of my 30 years. I was born and raised here. My dad a fabricator at the aircraft assembly plant, my mom a waitress at a local diner. I played linebacker for Tavern High School, even setting the record for most tackles in a season, and career record as senior set to break this year. After high school, I served for years in the Marine Corps as a rifleman, completing to tour in Afghanistan, where I was awarded a Silver Star for valor. Upon returning, I joined the Hilux County Sheriff's Department, and after 2 years as a patrol deputy, I was assigned to the Special Enforcement Bureau Tactical Team, essentially SWAT. Some people have lofty dreams, but I've lived mine. I enjoy work that provides bursts of adrenaline, and I come home to my high school sweetheart, the hottest cheerleader at Tavern High title that will never be broken. We had even begun discussing the possibility of having kids. She might be pregnant right now. So when I perceived a threat, I naturally felt compelled to intercept it. I'm not the type to shy away from a challenge. It's a core tenet of my being. Unfortunately, I may have finally encountered a challenge I can't meet. Without further ado, let me tell you the story of how my life fell into ruin. It all began nearly a year ago, with what should have been the highlight of a law enforcement officer's career night, when I stopped a very bad guy and saved a young girl's life. Summertime in Hilux County is unbearably hot. Life in a high desert is relentless. The thermometer peaked at 115 degrees that day, forcing us to forego our planned training for gear checks and waiting around the station for any callouts. Frankly, I was hoping for a peaceful day. During heat waves, there is an odd compromise for a tactical team. Most of our callouts involve barricaded suspects, where we establish a perimeter, shut off the air conditioning, and let them sweat until they give up. The downside, we endure that same oppressive heat in tactical gear and heavy vehicles. All right, boys, off your asses. We've got a call. Lieutenant Robert Howell, our team leader and a man who fancies himself a modern cowboy, has stopped in, crushing our hopes under the weight of his spurs. Barricaded suspect with a hostage at Plainview Estates, a collective groan echoed among the team. We'd been dragged into exactly what we dreaded. Nevertheless, we grabbed our gear and began loading it into the Bearcat, ready to head out. By 1:30 p.m., the armored vehicle was rolling out, flanked by two cruisers with sirens blaring as we sped toward the residential neighborhood. "What's the deal, LT?" asked Darius Milton, a longtime friend who joined the tactical team with me. "Not all the details yet, but it doesn't look good. A nosy neighbor reported a break-in screaming and gunshots. Patrol responded just as the suspect was leaving with a child. They think they wounded him, but he retreated inside. Negotiator is on scene trying to make contact. Arm, pervert, great," Darius muttered, not wanting to interrupt Howell. "Dude deserves a bullet in the nuts, but instead he's probably bleeding to death in an air-conditioned room. Won't be air-conditioned for long. Maybe we'll get lucky and he'll poke his head out." By 2:15 p.m., we arrived at the scene, stepping into the hottest part of the day. The Bearcat was parked near the front of the house, with cruisers blocking off the neighborhood. We dismounted, and Howell approached the negotiator while we surveyed the area. A police car near the Bearcat had shattered windows and a passenger door pocked with bullet holes. A small pool of blood dripped from the door, sizzling on the asphalt. The two-story home stood with its front door open and glass panes shot out. "Looks like more than a few shots fired," I murmured, more to myself than anything. Darius nodded, scanning the scene. "Hope the deputy is okay, but that doesn't look good." His tone held a fatalism that reflected our fears. A Helix County deputy hadn't been killed in the line of duty in nearly 4 years, and we both knew we might be looking at the end of that streak. "Gather round." Howell called, and we joined him behind the Bearcat's armored walls. Rage burned in his eyes, cold and pure hatred. "We've got a real nasty son of a bitch in there. Deputy Beagle took a bullet during the confrontation and is en route to Memorial in critical condition." His words led to an uncomfortable silence, the weight of our colleagues' fight for life hanging over us. After a moment, I broke the silence. "So what happened here, Lieutenant?" "The house belongs to John and Claire Treppa," he replied, his voice laced with anger. "Both cars in the driveway are theirs, but the third is listed as a stolen vehicle from Barron County. According to the neighbor, a man pulled up, broke in, and then gunshots and screams followed. Deputies arrived just as the suspect was leaving with the Treppa's 13-year-old daughter. He fired at them, and they returned fire, wounding him in the shoulder. Beagle's partner chased him inside, but the suspect holed up in the master bedroom with the girl, threatening to kill her if anyone tries to enter." "What's the game plan?" Darius asked, dread creeping into his voice. We were men of action, and the thought of a prolonged negotiation felt unbearable. "Darius, Cliff, you to relieve the officer inside. Keep that door under watch. If you have a chance, take it. Otherwise, we wait for the negotiations to end. The rest of us will maintain watch outside unless something changes." We didn't protest. It was scorching hot, and the second floor would only worsen as the sun began to dip. Clad in heavy tactical gear, we'd be trapped in a personal sauna for hours, all while waiting for a lunatic to decide whether to bleed out or come out guns blazing. The thought of a peaceful surrender didn't even seem possible. Without complaint, Darius and I double-checked our rifles, strapped on our helmets, and headed inside. I've witnessed horrific things in my time aftermath of drone strikes, bodies shredded by gunfire. But this struck me differently. Despite the heat, I felt cold sweat running down my face. "Damn," Darius whispered as we entered the living room. What appeared to be John Treppa sat on the couch, clearly watching TV. when the break-in occurred. One arm draped over the back, he was half-turned, as if startled by the noise of the intrusion. The top half of his skull was missing, chunks splattered across the wall, drips of viscera painting the television, still flickering with images beneath. This wasn't a clean decapitation. It was an act of hatred. The killer had stood there, shooting him multiple times. As we moved into the hallway, we found Claire, another victim of this twisted madness. Unlike her husband, she hadn't been shot. Her death bore the marks of slow brutality. Her blouse, once blue, was now tattered, with 47 puncture wounds made by a blade. The carpet beneath her was soaked in blood, and I imagined the cleanup would require removing the flooring down to the cement, likely revealing more stains underneath. Arterial spatter lined the walls, and even the ceiling, a nightmarish sight I had never encountered since joining the sheriff's department. On task. "We've still got a live person to worry about," Darius reminded me, pulling me back to the present. "I hope we still do. This fucker is clearly not right." Bloody shoe prints marked our path to sets leading us away from the carnage. One set, not deeply stained, belonged to the standard issue shoes worn by uniformed deputies. The other, deeply imprinted and soaked in blood, were hiking boots. Both sets led to the stairwell, an ascending U-turn that took us to the second floor. "Friendly," I called as we advanced. The deputy at the top of the stairs briefly glanced at us before returning his focus to the door at the end of the hallway. I recognized him instantly. Deputy Pollock, a training officer with the department since before my teenage years. His gaunt face glistened with sweat, eyes filled with a mix of horror and rage. "Relax, Pollock. We've got it from here," Darius assured him quietly. We took up better positions. Darius lay on the hallway carpet with his rifle aimed at the door, while I found cover behind a credenza, doing the same. "Yeah." Pollock spoke in a low tone, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. For the first time, the grim reality of the situation was dawning on him. He holstered his pistol, took a few steps down, then turned back to face us. "That guy isn't right. There was just something off about the whole thing. He isn't going to come out peacefully. You'd better be ready to go in there." "We're ready. Don't worry, the girl is still alive," I asked, my gaze fixed on the door as I shouldered my rifle, lining the scope with the center of the doorway. "I've heard her whimper and cry a few times. I don't think he's hurt her yet, but given the opportunity, he will. You see what he did down there?" The anger and fear in Pollock's voice was palpable, a reminder that even seasoned veterans can feel the weight of horror. "We need something, some small sliver of good to come out of here, and the only thing left is that poor girl's life." With that, Pollock began down the stairs, but paused at the bottom, looking back up at us. "She's about 4'7". He's around 6'3". Nothing more needed to be said. The implication hung in the air between Darius and me. We adjusted our rifles, our aim drifting higher. I thumbed the fire selector to the burst mode and settled in for what felt like an eternity. There were no words to exchange. We were singularly focused on the door at the end of the hall. But I couldn't shake the images of the carnage downstairs. What kind of hatred drives a man to commit such acts? Time crawled. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. The heat in the upstairs hallway was suffocating as the sun beat down on the house, and I imagined how much worse it must have been in that cramped bedroom. Occasionally, we heard the girl cry out, the sound piercing through the thick tension. We heard him too, the man we would later identify as Thomas' friend, shouting into a phone at the negotiator outside. Then came the moment that shattered the stillness at 6:27 p.m. "No, no, please, no, don't." Her shrieks were filled with terror, and my heart sank. "Now, we've got to go," Darius urged, and I didn't hesitate to agree. We rushed to the end of the hall. No time to radio for backup. I positioned myself in front of the door. Darius angled slightly to my side. No. Again the girl's cry echoed, filled with desperation. Do it, I urged as Darius kicked the door just under the handle. The flimsy tracked home door shattered, one hinge tearing free as it flew open. Inside, I saw Thomas's hand gripping the girl's throat, the other raised with a knife ready to plunge down. He looked at me, but in that moment my instincts took over. I pulled the trigger. Once the rifle fired 3 bullets in quick succession. One struck his sternum, another his chest, the third piercing his collarbone. He fell back, gurgling, clutching at the wounds as blood spilled onto the carpet. Get her out of here now, I ordered, and Darius moved swiftly, lifting the girl and rushing her down the stairs. This wasn't my first life taken, but watching someone die up close was different. Thomas was more monster than man, and yet, in those final moments, I felt a sense of dread wash over me, something deeply wrong about what I was witnessing. To clarify, my recollection of this moment has been influenced by everything that followed. In those seconds, I focused on him, my weapon still trained, ready to finish what I'd started. But he remained still, slumped against the wall, hand clutching the wound at his collar. His eyes locked onto mine, and as he wheezed, struggling for breath, he smiled a twisted, sickly grin smeared with blood. The sight twisted my gut. He had brutally ended lives, ruined that girl's world, yet he wore that expression of triumph. I felt no joy in his demise, just a cold chill that cut deeper than the day's horror. My weapon was still aimed at him when Howell and the rest of the team entered, securing the scene. Howell ordered me out, the room now a backdrop to an officer-involved shooting. As I descended the stairs, I tried to avoid the gruesome sights below, but the images burned into my memory. Exiting the Trepa residence, I hoped for some respite, but a gust of wind chilled me to the bone. My stomach lurched, the gravity of the day crashing down on me. I turned and vomited into a nearby hedge, expelling everything I had consumed. It felt as if my insides were twisting, nodding in a way I couldn't understand. Cliff, man, you okay? Darius knelt beside me, concern etched across his face. Yeah, I'm fine, just the heat, I lied. I had no desire to explain what was truly happening inside me. Detectives arrived to take control, and soon the tactical team headed back to the station for debriefing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The moment I stepped outside, the weight of what I had experienced hung heavily around me like a shroud. As I sat in the quiet of my truck, staring at the steering wheel, I wrestled with the visions of the girl and friends, his grotesque smile imprinted in my mind. It took several minutes for me to start the engine. Halfway home, I stopped at a gas station, purchasing a pack of cigarettes, an old habit I thought I had kicked. Surprisingly, they calmed my nerves as I stood in my driveway, smoking beneath the oppressive summer night. I finished before stubbing them out and tossing the remnants into the garbage bin. A quick spray of cologne masked the odor. A feeble attempt to avoid a lecture from my wife, I entered the house, the warmth inside contrasting sharply with the chill in my bones. We ate dinner, shared small talk about our day, and then retreated to bed. All I wanted was a good night's sleep, a fleeting escape from the weight pressing down on me. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't find it. The nightmares began that night, and sleep became an elusive comfort. I had just begun to drift into a semblance of peaceful sleep, the gentle sound of my wife's snoring lulling me into a false sense of security. But then came the rattling sound that shattered the stillness of the night. My home sits in a rural part of the county, surrounded by a lawn, that drinks in too much water and swaths of desert brush. It's not unusual for coyotes or other wildlife to wander close, but they rarely venture up to the house. The scratching at the glass sliding door jolted me upright. With a heavy sigh, I reached for my pistol resting on the knit-stand and climbed out of bed. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence, another creature passing through. I was naive. As I stepped into the living room, the shadowy figure pressed against the door sent a chill down my spine. A hand tugged at the handle while another scratched at the glass, the shape of a head peering in. Cold sweat drenched my back, and my heart raced, caught between the instinct to confront an intruder and the primal urge to run. I flicked on the mounted flashlight attached to my handgun, aiming it at the door. My hands trembled, the grip on my pistol weakening. My finger hovered over the trigger guard, paralyzed by a fear that clawed at my insides. What stood before me was not human. Even now I struggled to describe it. Humanoid in form, it had 2 muscular legs and arms, but the hands and feet were grotesquely elongated, with dark yellow nails resembling sharpened spikes. Its face was a canvas of taut albino skin, with a gaping mouth filled with sharp teeth and dark spittle. The most chilling aspect were its eyes, solid black, fixed directly on me as it licked the glass with a barbed tongue. Every instinct screamed to shoot, to empty my magazine into that monstrosity, but the thought of shattering the glass and inviting it inside held me back. Instead, we stared at each other in a silent standoff. After a moment, it brushed its hand against the glass in an unsettlingly affectionate gesture, then began to step back, fading from view. Somehow, I managed to convince myself to return to bed, shutting my eyes against the terror. But sleep eluded me, the night stretching out with the slightest sound, sending my heart racing. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I was losing my mind. But the creeping dread hung over me until dawn broke. My wife woke and began her morning routine, a small comfort amidst the chaos of my thoughts. 30 minutes later, I finally dragged myself out of bed and headed to the kitchen. She stood there, 2 cups of coffee in hand, the normalcy of our morning routine offering a temporary reprieve. "So what do you have planned for today?" she asked. "Probably just hanging around here." "There are a few things that need fixing," I reply, attempting to keep my voice steady. "Sounds good." She smiled, grabbing her purse and kissing my cheek. "Maybe you can do something about the sliding door. A coyote must have scratched it pretty badly last night. That was just the beginning. I wish I could say it was the end, but the truth is that I still get those nighttime visitors. Strange occurrences have plagued me since that night. I may have lied when I said this would be the only time I'd share my experience, but writing it down has offered some relief. Yet, dredging through the story again fills me with dread. It's getting late, and I'm bracing myself for the unknown. I never know when my visitor will return. I can only hope someone out there knows more than I do about what lurks in the darkness. At the very least, thank you for lending your sympathetic ears. I'm in over my head, and I can't shake the feeling that something evil has settled in Helix County. I'll admit I was unsure how sharing my story would be received, but the interest and empathy from others, rather than criticism or dismissal, was a welcome change from the reactions of those closest to me. They had brushed off my fears when I first confided in them. So here I am, ready to delve deeper into what has transpired since that fateful night. While I appreciate having sympathetic ears, I still yearn for someone who might possess actual knowledge about what I am dealing with. Where did I leave off? Right the morning after the incident and the week of dread that followed. When my wife mentioned the scratches on the sliding glass door, my heart raced, though I tried to hide my alarm. I waited until I heard the front door click shut behind her before I mustered the courage to investigate. Sure enough, there were gouges in the glass shallow enough not to break through, but deep enough to leave a lasting mark. She had assumed it was a coyote, a reasonable conclusion at first glance. Yet, as I examined the damage more closely, I realized a coyote couldn't have reached that high or dug so deeply into tempered glass. The creature I had encountered, whatever it was, monster, demon, or abomination, would have been capable of such destruction. Breath quickening, I stepped out onto the back deck, scanning for anything that might validate my fear or at least offer proof that I hadn't imagined the whole ordeal. Disappointment washed over me. There were no footprints, nothing unusual. The smudges left on the glass from where the creature had licked it were my only tangible reminder, and without black spittle to collect as evidence, the monster remained firmly lodged in my mind. I hoped, maybe foolishly, that with some rest and a break from stress, it would fade into memory. Yet, a nagging unease clung to me, a persistent feeling at the base of my spine and instinct that I recalled from my days as a deputy, when seasoned officers cautioned me not to ignore my gut feelings. Another mantra echoed in my head: hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That lesson had been imparted to me by one of the most hardened sergeants during my first tour in Afghanistan, responding to my complaints about unnecessary preparations when we weren't expecting an attack. His words were far more colorful than I can repeat here, but there was undeniable wisdom in them. With time on my hands and plenty of home improvement projects I had long neglected, I decided to act. I made a quick trip to the hardware store, returning with resin to fill the glass gouges, a powerful motion-activated floodlight, and external cameras to mount around the house. The installation consumed my morning and afternoon, a welcome distraction from the thoughts that haunted me. By the time my wife returned home, I had dinner cooking and felt a sense of accomplishment. That evening I crawled into bed beside her, and for the first time in days, sleep embraced me, though unease still lingered in my mind. The next morning I rushed to check the video feeds, desperate for reassurance, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The following 2 days passed without incident. On August 6th, news broke that Deputy Beagle had succumbed to his injuries sustained while confronting Thomas' friends. I didn't know Beagle personally, but the tragedy connected us forever. Colleagues reached out, sharing their sorrow over the loss and congratulating me for avenging Beagle by taking down friends. Oddly, their words offered me no comfort. A year later, I still believe that if they truly understood what I had experienced, they wouldn't have praised me at all. Killing friends had made me a pawn in a larger game, one far beyond my comprehension. I chose not to attend the funeral, though I planned to pay my respects privately later. On August 8th, I had a mandated appointment with a counselor in a small office near the Helix County Mall. The meeting was uneventful, forcing me to relive the shooting and discuss my feelings about it. I kept my answers brief, and deliberately omitted any mention of the bizarre incidents or thoughts that had plagued me since. Many deputies have navigated these sessions without truly engaging, and I wouldn't be the last. While the availability of such help is essential, the looming fear of saying the wrong thing and jeopardizing my career made it hard to be honest. I had no guilt about the shooting. My issues ran far deeper, far beyond what a county-contracted shrink could fathom. The 10th day of August marked my return to work, though I found myself relegated to desk duty for a week before rejoining the tactical team. While I would never forget the events of the 2nd, nearly a week had passed without incident, and I was beginning to convince myself that perhaps the tumultuous date had just played tricks on my mind. That illusion was shattered when an unexpected visitor arrived at the station. I was seated at the front desk when he approached. "How can I help you?" I asked, taking in the sight of a man in a suit who seemed out of place in our small station. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a badge. "Agent Donovan, FBI, I'm looking for Deputy Belensky." He glanced at my name tag and then met my gaze. "Ah, that would be you. I've been trying to reach you for the past few days. I called a few times. Yes, sir. Sorry about that. I've been off." I felt a pang of guilt for having ignored his calls, assuming they were from reporters seeking a statement about the shooting. "Damn, it's hot here. How do you all stand it?" Agent Donovan was tall and heavy-set, beads of sweat forming around his collar as he fidgeted with his tie. "We need to talk, but not out here. Can you get us an interview room?" I paged a deputy to cover for me and led Donovan through the back, past the offices, grabbing 2 bottles of water from the fridge before heading down to the basement cell block. We entered an unoccupied interview room plain with bare walls and a table with 2 chairs. I set a bottle in front of him and opened the other for myself. "What does the FBI need from me?" I asked, curiosity piqued, though I had a sinking feeling it had to do with friends, basic administration. "I need to go over your statement regarding the shooting. Friends was on our radar. We thought he was still active up in Barron County. Surprise, surprise, he turns up dead down here." Donovan set a briefcase on the table and pulled out a printed copy of my statement to Internal Affairs. "Good on you for that, by the way, if anyone deserved it." "Wait," I interrupted, the realization hitting me hard. "You knew about him, like you were aware of his activities." "Like I said, we thought he was still in Barron County. He's always been slippery, able to operate under our noses. Didn't expect him to show up 10 hours away." He loosened his coat, revealing a tattoo of the eagle, globe, and anchor on his forearm. A flicker of camaraderie ignited between us, "You served." I nodded at his tattoo, rolling up my sleeve to reveal my own, the same brand etched onto my bicep. 88 to 92, machine gunner, Gulf War. "What about you?" "Afghanistan, twice rifleman." His demeanor softened a bit, and I felt a bond forming. "Look, I'm sure you've got questions. I'll tell you what I can, but we need to cover your report first. Sound good?" I nodded, and we delved into the details, retracing the events of that chaotic day. Donovan listened intently, cross-referencing my statements with the report, occasionally wiping sweat from his brow or gulping down his water. His minimal questions led me to believe this was more of a formality and an interrogation. Finally, as we neared the end of the report, he asked a question that obliterated my tenuous sense of normalcy. "Did you see any sign of an additional suspect in the house?" He met my gaze, and I sensed he was hoping for a different answer. "What? No. Just the one." My mind raced back to the chaos of that Dakeler's body, the blood, the 2 sets of shoe prints left behind. "Are you suggesting he had a partner?" The idea of a partner made chilling sense. Someone could have easily slipped out the back when Pollack and Beagle confronted friends at the front. They could have followed me home afterward. A shiver ran down my spine. The thought of someone lurking in the shadows was more than unsettling. Yet it was a plausible explanation that fit the disturbing puzzle. "We suspect so, but we don't have solid proof. The crime scenes this bastard left were always so chaotic it's hard to tell. But..." Donovan rummaged through his briefcase, pulling out a manila folder. He opened it, revealing a glossy sheet. 2021, Calvas City. "We're not sure if it's the first time he killed, but it's the first time we caught him on camera." The image showed friends exiting a duplex, his blood-splattered shirt evident as he looked directly at the camera. Behind him was a shadowy figure, distorted as if static obscured its features. The memory of the creature on my patio surged to the forefront of my mind. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. March 22nd, Tennyson friends broke into an apartment, killed a husband, wife, and their young son. Same bloody symbols all over the walls. We still don't know what they mean. Donovan leaned back, loosening his collar. An elderly neighbor looked out his peephole as friends was leaving and claimed he saw two others walking behind him, scared him so badly he had a heart attack. There were others lurking in the shadows, hidden in plain sight. Another glossy photo was slid across the table, and sure enough, it depicted friends walking away, to static figures trailing behind him. My mouth went dry, and I took a drink of water, almost wincing as I swallowed. Donovan observed my distress, but remained unaware of its true cause. He collected the photos and produced another one, a still from Darius' gun camera. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a shadowy figure peering from the laundry room. Hell of a coincidence, don't you think? He asked, clearly eager for my take. That couldn't be anyone. We had the house surrounded by then. It should have been cleared before we engage friends. Could that thing have been hiding in the house, slipping past us while we were focused on the carnage? I'm inclined to believe you. That footage from your camera got corrupted. The Bureau's IT team said they couldn't recover it. Even asked them to try, but no dice. He drummed his fingers on the table, glancing at the photo before taking it back. The body cameras didn't capture it either. I thought maybe he had a jammer, but that would have affected friends too. And nothing was found at any of the scenes. One more thing. Another spread of photos landed before me, 6 this time. Calvus City, Tennyson. Those 3 are from Brenner County, and that last one is from the Trepa house. Not sure if that's just more of his crazy symbols, but they kind of look like photo or handprints, don't they? They did. For of the 6 photos showed what could be interpreted as blotted impressions on the ceilings of their respective crime scenes. Each one exhibited puncture marks, resembling a grotesque array of toes or fingers like the gouges that had marred my sliding glass door. The last image, from the Trepa house, was the most unsettling. It suggested something had been there with us, likely the same creature I had seen that night. Where was this taken? I asked, though the blood splatter was already a confirmation I didn't want to admit. Above the sofa, right above Mr. Trepa's corpse. They have no ridge details, though, so even if they are prints, we have nothing to compare them with. I remembered the chaos. John Trepa's head split open, likely by gunfire, but now. So what you're saying is there could be 2 more complete psychopaths out there who don't leave a trace of their passage except for these markings. I met Donovan's gaze, but he merely shrugged, collecting the pictures to stow them away. I wish I had a better answer. What we have is all speculation. If it's a group, who knows how friends getting taken down will impact their dynamic. He handed me his card with contact information. If you remember anything worth mentioning, or if something else pops up, give me a call. Yeah, sure. I pocketed the card, my mind racing with the unsettling notion that I might know something, but it felt utterly unbelievable. You did a good thing, taking friends down. You spared those families the anguish of a trial. A mistrial would have devastated them. He stood up, gathered his belongings, and headed toward the door. Don't let it weigh on you too much. Semper Fi. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank my head into my palms, overwhelmed by the revelations. It was all circumstantial, wasn't it? Monsters weren't real, at least, not the kind that lurked in the shadows. I had witnessed true monstrosity in the war and at countless crime scenes, flesh and blood. Yet my breathing quickened as I repeated to myself that these were just the deranged rituals of a crazed man who was now dead. Still, the thought clung to me. After 30 minutes, I finally collected myself enough to leave the interview room and return to the front desk. Work offered little distraction. My mind was consumed by the images Donovan had shown me, the static figures, and the knowledge of what could be hiding beneath the surface. The realization that these things had taunted me at home made me feel sick. As my shift ended, I changed into civilian clothes, strapped my duty weapon to my belt, and headed out to the parking lot. I sat on the back of my truck, smoking my third cigarette since exiting the station, when Darius approached. "Hey, Cliff, they had you hidden in a cubicle all day?" He stopped, his eyes scrutinizing me. "Shit, you look a little pale." "You all right?" It's just, I was ready to spin another lie, but the weight of what Donovan had shown me fought against that instinct. I felt a desperate need to unburden myself, even if cautiously. "Can we grab a beer? I need to talk about something." Darius nodded, and we agreed to meet at a small bar just a few blocks away, a brick building where the department often celebrated. The place was fairly empty, save for a few regulars and staff. A baseball game played on the television, the Astros and Orioles locked in a tight contest. We settled into a corner booth, and the waitress, a woman I recognized from high school, approached. "Hey boys, Cliff, I saw you in the paper. They'll have to dedicate an entire archive to you at this rate." For the first time in a week, I chuckled a little. Football legend, war hero, town savior. "He's going to be a shoo-in when he runs for office," Darius teased, further ribbing me as I sank back into the booth. "Definitely. Sheriff Belensky, maybe. Don't worry, Cliff, if they call me about your antics from high school, I'll keep them to myself." She smiled, perhaps flirting, but I knew it wouldn't go any further. "What can I get you to?" "Just 2 beers, please." "We won't be long," I returned her smile as she left to fetch them, soon returning with the drinks, informing us they were on the house from the owner. We made small talk as we nursed our beers, the bottles sweating in our hands. We discussed family, how our wives were doing, upcoming plans, the usual. I mentioned a prospective trip to Hawaii that would never materialize, while Darius proudly shared about his toddlers, a boy and a girl, something he loved talking about. "Did the FBI want to talk to you?" I finally asked, after we exhausted the usual topics. Darius took another swig from his beer before setting it down. "Only for a few minutes. Wanted to go through the report and footage. Your gun cam's footage got corrupted. The deputy chief even called in, chewed out the IT guys for losing it." "Yeah, I heard that. It's kind of weird. I watched the footage with when we were reviewing everything." I began, but Darius cut me off. "About that there was some kind of glitch in the footage." "What happened?" "Well," I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Darius was as close a friend as I had, but even the craziest idea could give him pause. It distorted Friends' face. You know those apps kids use to put filters on pictures? It was like that, but looked like something from a horror movie. "Do you think that could have caused the recording to get corrupted?" "No, I'm no tech guy, but those cameras don't do much beyond adjust focus. None of the other cameras had issues. The only thing distorting his face was him dying." Ridden said that. "Donovan said he was involved in several murders. I saw the files. He was definitely sick." I thought again of the strange prints, the static figure unseen, and the shadows. "Did Donovan ask you if Friends had any partners?" "Yeah, but there was no one else at the house. We had it surrounded and cleared top to bottom after. It's possible someone slipped away as soon as it went sideways, but we found no evidence." We both took another swig, and I noticed my beer disappearing faster than Darius. We had deputies keeping an eye on out-of-towners, but they all checked out. If he had associates, they're either laying low or already gone. If they poke their heads up, we'll nail them. I nodded, a sense of unease settling deeper within me. The shadows loomed larger than ever, and I wondered just how far the darkness stretched. "Do you believe in monsters?" I blurted out, catching Darius off guard. He raised an eyebrow, leaning back in the booth. "What?" "Like the chupacabra. Hey, it's real. Back in high school, Otis Granger's goat got eaten by it. It was his dog, Man. I was there when we got the call. That dog was still licking its chops when we arrived." We both laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Do you think there could be real monsters out there? Like what, aliens?" Darius joked. "Come on, we're just messing around," I said, that my heart wasn't in it. I was becoming two people. One who wanted to ignore the truth, and one who was terrified. I went to the bathroom to collect myself. The flickering fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, revealing the grimy walls. I splashed water on my face, trying to calm down. When I left, I found Darius waiting outside. We shook hands, and just then my phone rang. It was my wife, and she sounded panicked. "Someone broke in. The door locks kicked in." "Stay down the driveway," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. Darius and I rushed to my house, our service weapons ready. As we approached, the familiar home felt wrong, dark, and unsettling. We split up to check each room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of violation hung heavily in the air. "Clear left," Darius called. "Clear right," I responded, relieved. We regrouped and found nothing missing, but the front door was damaged. "Must have been a quick in and out," Darius said, shrugging it off. But my gut twisted. I had set up security cameras and decided to check the footage. When I reviewed it, my heart dropped. Around 4:30 p.m., I saw two static figures moving up my driveway and entering my house. Then, moments later, they returned and disappeared off-screen. Under Darius' truck, static blurred the view. "Pick up, pick up." I yelled into my phone as I called Darius, but he didn't answer. I jumped in my truck and sped off, hoping to find him safe. But when I reached the road, I saw his truck flipped over, its cabin crushed. "Oh God, no," I whispered. I approached the wreck, trembling, and found Darius inside, lifeless, blood pooling around him. I fell to my knees, crushed by the reality of what had just happened. Hours passed in a blur as I called for help, then went to inform Darius' wife. Her cries of anguish pierced my heart. I returned home around 2:30 a.m., still in shock. As I lay in bed, a floodlight outside tripped, illuminating my room. I looked up to see 5 puncture marks on my ceiling, like claws. In that moment, I knew the monsters were real. This wasn't the end of my horrors, but it felt like one of the worst. I miss Darius deeply and grieve for his family. I know the truth, but without proof, I can't convince anyone. If he were still here, maybe I wouldn't feel so alone in this fight. I promise to make this right, Darius. I'm still here for you. I can barely remember what life was like before we found that game on a June night. We were 6 high school kids, bored out of our minds, trying to fill the time. Most of us had summer jobs, but we were saving for college, so we didn't want to spend much money. After hours of debating what to do, we decided to take a walk around our suburban neighborhood. It was the end of a yard sale day, and most people were packing up. A few were still outside, eager to sell the last of their stuff. We didn't plan to buy anything, but I always liked to look around, hoping to find a hidden treasure. Even though I usually regretted my purchases later, I started digging through a shoebox full of old board games, hoping to find one he could play together. Since it was the end of the day, I figured I could get it cheap. At first, I only found games that were either in terrible shape or ones I knew my friends wouldn't want to play. I'm a huge board game fan, but my friends, not so much. It took me months to convince them to play D&D for my birthday, and that was a one-time thing. I was always searching for a game they might actually enjoy. I was about to give up when I noticed a game at the bottom I'd never seen before. Tasks with Friends. The tagline read, "The game you and your friends will never want to put down." The box was colorful but worn, like it had been played many times. It looked old, but not so damaged that we couldn't use it. I tried to open it, but the sides were taped down, which made sense. No one wants game pieces flying everywhere. There wasn't a price on it. So I went to find the owner. "Excuse me, how much for this game?" I asked, excited by my find. "Oh, that old thing? I don't know. Do you have $1 on you?" she said, barely looking at me as she packed up her unsold items. I started digging through my purse, but before I could find anything, she waved her hand. "Just take it," she said, going back to her packing. I couldn't help but ask, "Is the game any fun?" She shrugged. "I never played it. My friend Jeanne gave it to me a few years ago because her kids got obsessed with it. She wanted it out of her house, but my family never got around to playing it." I thanked her and called my friends over to show them what I found. When they saw it was a board game, their excitement faded quickly. They rolled their eyes, knowing I was going to try to get them to play it with me. "Kate, you know we don't do board games," Aaron said, already annoyed. "Come on, guys. You've all been complaining about how bored you are. At least give it a try. It looks like fun, and none of us have played it before, so we can all learn together," I said, hoping to spark their curiosity. James came over and gestured for the box. I handed it to him, knowing if he got on board, everyone else would follow. As he examined the box, I watched his expression change from doubt to interest. "Damn, this actually looks fun. Let's go play," he said, sounding more excited than I'd ever heard him before. He started jogging toward his house with me right behind him and the rest of the group trailing behind, looking confused. James was usually the one most against playing board games, so his sudden enthusiasm was surprising. We got to James' house and walked inside, where his mom gave us a confused look. She wasn't used to seeing her son so excited about anything. Before we could explain, we heard James calling us from the basement. We ran downstairs to find the game already set up on the floor. James was sitting on a pillow, reading the instructions with intense focus. "James, are we really going to play this?" Bree whined. "Yes, we are. I promise. Once you start playing, you'll have fun." I had time to learn the rules while you guys were coming over, James said as he shuffled the pile of cards. After some back and forth, everyone eventually sat down. James began to explain the rules straight from the instruction manual. At first, we all laughed it off, thinking the game was just getting creative. "That's wild," Aaron said, chuckling. "How'd the game know you were working today?" He raised an eyebrow at AJ, but none of us were really concerned. The game was fun, and no one wanted to stop playing. We continued on, diving deeper into the cards, each more intriguing than the last. As time went on, the tasks got stranger. A card I drew instructed me to steal something from another player without getting caught. It was labeled as a secret task, and I immediately felt a jolt of adrenaline. I had to swipe something subtle, but noticeable enough for me to call attention to it later without anyone catching me in the act. During the next few rounds, I saw my chance. AJ's phone was sitting next to her, slightly out of reach, but she was too focused on her task to notice me. While James was explaining the rules of his new public card, I slid her phone into my hoodie pocket. No one saw. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to sit still and act normal. 2 rounds later, when it was my turn again, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Task completed, I announced, moving my token 3 spaces forward. AJ checked her pockets for her phone and gasped. "Wait, did you take my phone?" she asked in disbelief. And when I revealed it, we all burst into laughter. But as the hours ticked by, the game slowly started to take a darker turn. It wasn't obvious at first. More cards started referencing personal details about us, things the game shouldn't have known. Aaron drew a secret card that required him to text his ex-girlfriend something embarrassing without getting caught. He seemed hesitant at first, but he did it. When the notification popped up on his phone a few minutes later, we all screamed with laughter. James drew a public card that said, "Break something valuable in the house." We thought it was funny until he picked up a family photo frame and smashed it without hesitation. His mother's face in the photo looked so sad as the glass cracked across it. None of us said anything, but it felt like we had crossed an invisible line. Henry drew a card that instructed him to lock the front door and don't let anyone leave until the game is over. It was a secret task. So when he quietly stood up and did it, we didn't notice right away. It wasn't until much later, when Aaron tried to leave for a quick break, that we realized we were locked in. We all laughed nervously, thinking it was just Henry being funny. But when I saw the look on his face, I knew something was off. He shrugged, saying, "Hey, it was my card. I can't lose." Right, that's when Bree drew her next card. She hesitated, looking down at it for a long time before reading it out loud. Public card. Tell the group your darkest secret. The room fell silent. Bree was always the strong, stoic one in the group, never showing vulnerability. We all waited, expecting her to say something silly or brush it off, but her face turned pale. "I can't. I don't want to," she whispered. James egged her on. "Come on, it's just a game. We all know it's not that serious." But Bree shook her head. "No, you don't understand. This secret, it could ruin everything." We sat in stunned silence, watching her fidget with the card. Her hand trembled as she placed it on the ground, staring at it like it was a loaded gun. Suddenly, AJ spoke up, her voice shaky. "Guys, maybe we should stop playing." But it was too late. The game had us in its grip. Henry drew his next card, a secret task again, and I noticed his hands were shaking too. His eyes darted between us as if he was suddenly afraid. "I'm out," I said, standing up. "This game is getting too weird." "No, wait." Aaron grabbed my arm. "We can't just quit. The rules, what if something bad happens if we stop now?" I scoffed. "It's just a game, a stupid game. We can stop whenever we want." But Henry's voice came out in a low whisper. "We can't." I froze. "What do you mean, we can't?" "I tried," he muttered, his eyes wide with fear. "When you guys went to the bathroom earlier, I tried to stop. I tried to put the cards back in the box, but it wouldn't let me." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my stomach churning. "The box, it closed itself." Henry's voice cracked, and he glanced at the game with terror in his eyes. "We're not in control anymore." No one moved. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time that night I felt genuinely afraid. Page's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She jumped, checking her screen. "It's my manager. He says if I don't come to work, I'm fired." We stared at her, speechless. "What do we do?" Bree asked, her voice shaking. "Now we can't just keep playing, but as if in response, the deck shuffled itself. Cards began to lift from the top, slowly floating into the air before dropping back down. Ready for the next player, the game wasn't over, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted, and I wasn't sure if that was just to finish, or if it was something much worse. The air in the old treehouse was thick with anticipation as the next game began. Despite the musty smell and dim light, none of us seemed to care. We were like zombies, drawn back to this cursed game, and although we didn't admit it, we knew something was deeply wrong. But the pull was too strong. Like a drug we couldn't resist. Bree was the first to draw her card. It was a public one, and she read it aloud with shaky hands. To a handstand for as long as you can. Every second equals one space. The group cheered her on half-heartedly, but the excitement we once felt was starting to wane. Even the easy laughs and cheers didn't have the same spark as before. Bree gave a weak smile and attempted the handstand, failing miserably. It was obvious she wasn't focused. After a few seconds, she fell over onto the creaky floorboards, collapsing into a fit of nervous giggles. James smirked, pulling his card next, a secret one. He didn't even try to hide the glee on his face as he read it. "Guys, I have a secret task," he said, trying to suppress a grin. We all watched him intently, eyes wide, waiting for him to make his move. But Aaron cut in, grabbing his card. "Let's keep it moving. It's getting late." He flipped his card and groaned. It was another public one. "Sing twinkle, twinkle, little star," but replace every word with a rhyme, he muttered. Normally, we would have found it hilarious, but now it just felt forced. Aaron half-heartedly sang the ridiculous version of the song, his voice barely audible. No one was laughing anymore. "Task complete," he sighed, moving his token forward on the board. But it felt like a formality at this point. Then came AJ's turn. She pulled a secret card, and we all stiffened, wondering what it would be. She read it silently, her expression blank, but there was something about the way her face tightened that made me uneasy. Henry leaned forward, staring at her intently. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't respond. Instead, she just nodded and tucked the card into her pocket, her eyes darting from one person to another. The tension in the treehouse thickened. My turn was next, and I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the deck. I knew whatever card I drew would push me deeper into this madness, but I couldn't stop myself. The pull of the game was too strong. It was a public card. "Walk to the edge of the forest and scream for 30 seconds, I read aloud. Everyone exchanged uneasy glances. The tree house was deep enough in the woods that the nearest house was far off, but something about the task felt wrong. The forest seemed darker now, more sinister. "I'll do it," I muttered, standing up. As I climbed down the ladder and made my way to the edge of the clearing, I felt my heartbeat quicken. The moonlight barely lit the trees, and the air felt heavy, like the forest was watching me. I opened my mouth and screamed into the night, my voice echoing through the trees. It should have felt cathartic, but instead it felt like I was waking something up, disturbing something that had been slumbering for far too long. When I came back to the treehouse, everyone was sitting in a tense silence. No one asked me if I completed the task. It didn't matter anymore. The game wasn't about fun, and it wasn't about winning. It was about the control it had over us. The next few turns were a blur. People pulled cards, completed tasks, and moved tokens, but none of it registered. My mind was focused on how everything had changed. The cards were manipulating us, pitting us against each other, making us hurt the people we cared about most. James suddenly stood up, his face pale. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the secret card he had drawn earlier. His hands were shaking, and he threw it onto the board, his voice trembling as he spoke. My card said, "To push someone off the ladder." The group froze. "James, what the hell are you talking about?" Aaron asked, his voice incredulous. James looked at us, fear in his eyes. I didn't want to do it, but the card. It said I had to, or I would lose the game. Bree's face twisted in horror. "You were going to push someone off the ladder? Are you insane?" I couldn't, but don't you get it? This game it's controlling us. It's making us do things we don't want to do. A cold shiver ran down my spine. We all stared at the board, the tokens scattered across it like pieces in a sick game of chess. The realization hit us all at once. We weren't playing the game anymore. The game was playing us. AJ suddenly stood up, throwing her secret card to the ground. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I don't care about the points or the tasks or anything. This isn't fun. It's not a game. It's..." She was cut off by a loud cracking sound, followed by a thud as one of the wooden boards beneath her snapped. She fell to the floor, clutching her leg in pain. The rest of us rushed to help her, but as we did, I glanced down at the board. The cards were still there, waiting, and I realized something terrifying. We had never drawn the last card. The deck was endless. No matter how many games we played, there would always be another card, another task, another twisted challenge designed to pull us deeper into the nightmare. The treehouse was silent now, except for AJ's soft whimpers of pain. I looked around at my friends Bree, Henry, Aaron, James, and saw the same fear in their eyes. We needed to stop. We needed to get rid of the game, burn it, bury it, anything to break free from its grip. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was too late. The game had already won, and we were its players forever. James looked at Aaron in shock, his voice trembling. What was your card?" Aaron's lips quivered as he slowly opened his fist, revealing the blood-soaked card. None of us dared to look too closely, but the single phrase printed in bold black letters made my heart stop. "Kill someone for 30 spaces. The air felt thick, suffocating. No one spoke, but the horror was palpable. We stared at Aaron, at the blood on his hands, the weight of what he'd done sinking in. James began to shake, stepping back as if distancing himself from the reality of it all. "Who who did you double quotes?" Aaron dropped his head, his voice barely a whisper. "My mom. I didn't want to, but I had to. The game it made me do it." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The game wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. And now it had claimed a life. As much as I wanted to feel something, rage, sadness, disgust, all I could focus on was the growing urge inside me to complete my own task. My ankle throbbed in pain, but the craving to keep playing was stronger. I couldn't stop thinking about James' pinky finger. I needed those 10 points. But Aaron. He looked destroyed, hollowed out by his own actions, his blank stare fixed on the game board as if it was the only thing holding him together. "We have to stop this," Bree said, her voice shaky. "We have to walk away. Right now." For a moment, I saw the slightest flicker of hope. Maybe we could stop. Maybe we could put the game down, leave, and never return. But Aaron, broken as he was, shook his head slowly. "We can't stop. The game won't let us." And he was right. Every inch of me was screaming to keep playing. The pull was undeniable, like the game had wormed its way into my mind, my very soul. Before I could even think, AJ reached for her card. My heart raced. This was it, her secret card, the one that had something to do with me. She didn't even hesitate. With cold precision, she grabbed a jagged rock from the barn floor and, without a word, smashed it against my already broken ankle. The pain was beyond anything I had ever felt. I screamed in agony, thrashing as the sharp, blinding sensation shot through my leg. And then I noticed that she moved her token. She earned points for it. It hit me then. We weren't just hurting each other for the sake of the game. We were feeding off each other, gaining points like a sick reward. The deeper the pain, the more powerful the pull. It was the game's sick way of making sure none of us ever wanted to stop. "We have to finish this round," Henry said, his voice distant, as if he was no longer fully present. James, still shaken from what Aaron had done, slowly reached for his card, his hands trembling as he flipped it over. His face went pale. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring at the card in disbelief. Whatever it was bad. But I didn't get to find out what it said. Not right away. Suddenly, there was the sound of footsteps outside the barn. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. My heart raced as we all froze. Who could it be? Were the police here again? Had someone found out about Aaron's mom? The barn door creaked open. In the dim light, I saw a shadow step through. It was an older man, someone I didn't recognize. His face was calm, almost serene, as he walked straight to the game board, ignoring the blood, the broken bodies, the horror around him. He knelt down beside it and looked up at us. "I see you've been playing my game," he said quietly, his voice deep and unsettling. For a moment, none of us knew what to say, but Aaron spoke first, his voice trembling. "Your game." The man nodded, smiling softly. "I created it a long time ago. It's been passed down through generations, finding its way to those who are worthy. Bree whispered in horror, her face pale. The man looked at her with pity, as if she were a lost child. "It's not about winning or losing, you see. It's about survival, about embracing the game, understanding it. Those who finish they become part of something greater. I spat, wincing as the pain in my ankle flared again. "This is madness. It's killing us." A man chuckled softly, standing up and dusting off his pants. "It's not about killing. It's about sacrifice, commitment. The game chooses its players carefully. We don't want to play anymore," James blurted out, his voice desperate. The man's smile faded. He looked at James with cold, piercing eyes. "But you already have. And now there's only one way out." He pointed to the game board, and we all followed his gaze. There, right in the center of the board, was a single word we hadn't noticed before. "Finish." The man stepped back, folding his arms. "The game won't let you go until you do." Panic set in. I felt the walls closing in. There was no escape. No matter how badly we wanted to stop, we were trapped, bound to the game. James looked at us, his face pale. "So what do we do?" The man smiled again, that same unsettling calm washing over his face. "You keep playing." And so we did, because we had no choice. It was the last game we ever played. "Tell me what you did right now." "What the hell does your card say? Show us," James shouted, standing up in a rage. His voice boomed through the barn, echoing against the walls as the chaos mounted. Just as James was about to lunge at Aaron, Henry suddenly reached into his pocket, pulling out a matchbox we had used for campfires during our days on the run. We all froze, our eyes locked on Henry as he struck 3 matches and tossed them into the nearest hay bales. Instantly, the dry straw caught fire, flames spreading rapidly across the barn floor. AJ, without wasting a second, saw her chance. She stomped on my already damaged ankle with all her might. A sharp, sickening crack filled the air as my foot twisted grotesquely to the side. I bit back a scream, the pain beyond anything I had ever felt. And as if that wasn't enough, She slammed her foot onto my other ankle, leaving me completely immobilized. She moved her token 12 spaces, and, despite the agony, I felt an overwhelming high surge through me, the satisfaction of the game taking over every rational thought. In the midst of the madness, Aaron's hand slipped, and his card fell to the floor. James immediately dropped to his knees, grabbing the card with trembling hands. As he read the words aloud, his voice cracked with disbelief and fury. Secret card. Kill James' mom. Move 30 spaces. Tears welled in James' eyes as his anger boiled over. You did this ... for a stupid game. How could you? How could you kill my mom? Aaron's face was pale, his voice pleading, desperate. I didn't have a choice, James. You know what it's like. I couldn't control it. The game ... it made me. But James had reached his breaking point. His face twisted in a mix of rage and heartbreak. It's too late for that, he muttered, barely above a whisper. Then, with a primal roar, James threw himself at Aaron, his hands locking around Aaron's throat, squeezing with all his strength. Aaron thrashed under him, gasping for air, but James was beyond reason. The game's hold on him had snapped, replaced by pure, unfiltered hate. I could barely process what was happening as the fire grew hotter and higher, spreading through the barn with terrifying speed. In a horrifying blur, AJ pulled a pocket knife from her jacket and stabbed Bree in the stomach. Bree let out a choked gasp, clutching her wound as the two of them tumbled to the floor. Locked in a deadly struggle, I lay on the ground, helpless, my body wrecked by the damage to my ankles. The searing pain was overwhelming, but the chaos around me was even worse. I glanced across the barn and saw Henry sitting in silence, watching it all unfold. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw nothing but emptiness in his gaze. He reached for a card, even though it wasn't his turn. He didn't care anymore. I knew I had to escape. The fire was out of control, and if I didn't get out soon, I'd burn along with the rest of them. With a desperate grunt, I began dragging myself toward the barn door, ignoring the fire that now licked at my heels. I was barely able to move, but inch by inch, I pulled myself through the dirt. The game board clutched tightly in my hands. I glanced back one last time as I neared the exit. The barn was ablaze, flames roaring around the wooden beams. I saw Henry one last time. He wasn't trying to escape. Instead, he calmly placed his card on the board. Through the thick smoke, I managed to read it. Secret card. Let the fire overtake you. Move your token to the finish line and win the game. Henry didn't scream or struggle as the fire consumed him. He just stood there, motionless, accepting his fate as the flames engulfed him. With a final surge of strength, I dragged myself out of the barn just as it collapsed in a torrent of fire and debris. I was out barely, but I still had the game. As I lay on the ground, staring at the burning wreckage of the barn, I looked down at the game board in my hands, and despite everything, despite the death and destruction, all I could think about was one thing. Who would I play with now? I tried to start a new game. Alone, I picked a card, but before I could even read it, I heard sirens in the distance. Police cars and fire trucks pulled up next to me. Paramedics rushed over, trying to pull me away from the game. I screamed and fought them, my mind consumed by a single thought: I needed to play. I needed the game. It was my only purpose. They sedated me eventually, and I woke up in a hospital bed. They told me I was the only one who had survived that night. My friends, the barn, everything was gone. My parents sat by my side, tears in their eyes, but I didn't care about any of it. I only cared about the game. I was declared insane and spared any punishment for what had happened. Our families had enough influence to cover everything up: the deaths, the fires, even James' mother's disappearance. But none of it mattered to me. The only thing that mattered was the game, and when they told me the game was gone, destroyed in the fire, something inside me broke. I lashed out at the doctors, the nurses, anyone who tried to come near me. The withdrawals were unbearable. I screamed for days, my mind unraveling without the game to feed my addiction. Eventually, I was sent to a psychiatric hospital. They kept me drugged, but even through the haze of medication, I could feel the craving deep in my bones. I thought about the game every second, every hour. My body ached with the need to play. After months of pretending to get better, they finally sent me home. I had learned how to hide my obsession, how to mask the madness inside me. My room had been stripped of anything dangerous, no sharp objects, no shelves, no windows, without bars. They even put a lock on the door to keep me in. I sat on my bed, feeling hollow and empty. But as I looked around my barren room, something caught my eye, a flash of color at the back of my closet. My heart skipped a beat. I crawled over, my hands trembling as I reached into the darkness. And there was the game, the beautiful, colorful box, waiting for me. I tore it open, a wave of euphoria flooding through me. The paper cut from the box didn't even faze me. I sat down, ready to play once more, and that's when I drew my first card, secret card. Spread the word about this game online so more people can join us. Move 20 spaces. So what do you say? Care to join me for a game? The man with the canvas bag continued his breakdown, rocking back and forth on his knees, muttering something I couldn't quite hear. Lonnie was still on the phone, now pacing behind the counter, growing more and more frustrated as she tried to explain the gravity of the situation to the dispatcher. Meanwhile, I couldn't take my eyes off the strange crowd outside. They weren't just knocking on the glass, they were pressing their faces against it, staring blankly at us. Some were grinning, others expressionless, but all of them moved in this synchronized way, like they were being led by something we couldn't see. It wasn't just the weird clothing or the odd mannerisms. There was something deeply unsettling about their stillness, like they were waiting for the right moment to strike. I heard a loud crack as one of the glass doors groaned under the weight of their pushing. Lonnie's voice wavered as she pleaded with the dispatcher. "No, you don't understand. There's a mob trying to break in. This is not a robbery. This is ... something else. We need help now." Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, an older woman with a disheveled gray dress and messy hair. She had a vacant look in her eyes, but what struck me the most was the smile. It was too forced, like it was glued onto her face. She walked up to the door, placed her hand on the glass, and then slammed her head into it with a sickening thud. Blood trickled down her forehead, but she didn't stop. She kept slamming her head over and over, smiling the whole time. I could feel my stomach twist in knots. Lonnie screamed, dropping the phone. "They're going to break in," I shouted, rushing to grab anything we could use to barricade the doors. The homeless man, Benny, who had been gone for most of the evening, suddenly appeared. He came sprinting down the street and saw the chaos. Without hesitation, he grabbed a trash can and wedged it against the door to reinforce it. Benny may have been homeless, but at that moment he looked like the sanest person in the entire neighborhood. "They ain't right," Benny muttered as he pushed with all his strength. "None of them are right. Seen it before." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They ain't people no more," he said, eyes wide, still holding the door. "Not since that man came in with the bag." I glanced back at the man, still crumpled on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The salt he'd poured all over was now scattered everywhere, and he wasn't making any move to leave. He kept whispering something over and over again. Finally, I got close enough to hear, "It's not real. It's not real. They're not real." A loud crash snapped my attention back to the front. The woman had finally shattered the glass, and the mob outside was surging forward. Benny, Lonnie, and I scrambled to block the opening, but there were too many of them. As they pushed their way through the broken door, I realized this was far beyond anything I had ever seen. These weren't just looters or rioters, they were something much, much worse. The moment they crossed the threshold, a cold wave of dread hit me. The air in the store felt thick, oppressive, like we were being suffocated by the sheer presence of these intruders. I backed away slowly as they entered, moving in eerie silence despite the chaos. Each of them had that same vacant look, the same unnatural smiles plastered on their faces. Lonnie grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the store. "We need to get out now." As we made our way to the back exit, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The man with the canvas bag was still on the floor, now staring up at the ceiling, his lips moving silently. And then, in a moment that I'll never forget, he turned his head toward me and locked eyes. It's too late. We bolted out the back door just as the mob descended upon the store, their bodies pressing through the broken glass like a wave. I don't know how we managed to get away, but somehow we did. The last thing I saw before we turned the corner was Benny standing at the entrance, fending them off with nothing but his bare hands. To this day, I don't know what those people were or what that man was running from. But ever since that night, I've been haunted by that video clip, because now, every time I watch it, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, and they're still looking for us. Lonnie and I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what we were witnessing. These people, if you could still call them that, were tearing each other apart just to get at the strange, viscous substance from the canvas bag. The way they clawed at each other, mindlessly smearing the blue gel on their faces, arms, and bodies, it was like they'd lost all sense of self. There was no rhyme or reason, just pure animalistic desperation. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't survival. It was something else entirely. Lonnie, still holding her phone, recorded it all, but even she seemed numb at this point. There was no sense in calling for help anymore. No one would believe what was happening here, not even if they saw it with their own eyes. I had half a mind to take her by the arm and run for the back exit, but something held me there. I couldn't take my eyes off the chaotic mess of limbs and bodies, writhing in the aisle like worms in the mud. Suddenly, the man with the crowbar, the one who had vomited that dark liquid earlier, stood up. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, and his face was covered in that strange blue substance. His eyes, once cold and blank, now had a wild, crazed gleam. He didn't look at me or Lonnie, but instead he raised the crowbar and brought it down with a sickening thud right onto the head of one of the others in the pit. Lonnie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The man's victim crumpled instantly, but the others didn't even flinch. They kept scrabbling at the gel, oblivious to the violence around them. Without thinking, I grabbed Lonnie's hand. "We have to go now." She didn't argue. We sprinted toward the back of the store, pushing through the narrow stockroom and out the emergency exit. The alley behind the store was dark, but there was enough moonlight to see that no one was waiting for us, at least, not yet. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road. Panting and gasping for air, I looked back, half expecting the mob to come pouring out after us, but the alley remained silent. The convenience store was only partially visible from the street, and in that moment, it seemed like a black hole, an empty voice swallowing everything in its path. What the hell was that? Lonnie finally choked out between breaths. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," I whispered, still catching my breath. "But we're not going back. Whatever that was, it's not our problem anymore." Lonnie shook her head, still holding her phone tightly in her hand. "We need to call the cops again. Someone needs to stop them." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure if anyone could stop them. The people we'd seen weren't rioters, thieves, or even just disturbed individuals. They were something far worse, something I couldn't put into words. But one thing was clear. The man with the canvas bag had known this was going to happen. He'd tried to warn us. It hadn't made sense at the time, but now, looking back, his broken pleas and frantic behavior all pointed to one thing: he had been running from something far more terrifying than we could have imagined. "Let's just get out of here," I muttered. "We'll go to the next town, find a police station. We'll tell them everything." Lonnie nodded numbly, and we began walking down the road, leaving the store behind us. The night was still and quiet now, as if the world outside that convenience store had no idea what was happening inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over, that somehow whatever had taken hold of those people would spread. As we walked, Lonnie glanced down at her phone, scrolling through the video she had captured. Her hands were shaking. "No one's going to believe this. They'll have to," I replied, though deep down I wasn't so sure. But what happened next confirmed my worst fears. A car pulled up alongside us, its headlights blinding us for a moment. I raised my hand to shield my eyes, and when I looked again, my heart sank. The driver was one of them, the woman in the nightgown. Her eyes were vacant, that same eerie smile plastered across her face. She leaned out the window, and in that same belching, painful voice, she whispered, "Home, go home." I grabbed Lonnie and ran. He didn't stop until we couldn't hear the car anymore, and by the time we finally collapsed in a park on the edge of town, both of us were shaking uncontrollably. Whatever we had witnessed that night, it wasn't over. It was coming for us, and there was no going home. Not ever again. The night had pushed us to the edge of reason, and yet here we were, huddled in a bathroom with nothing but a flimsy door standing between us and what felt like an inevitable, violent end. My heart hammered in my chest, sensing with that eerie chant of them. The terror felt like it was burning through my veins, a kind of panic I had never known before. That night, when Lonnie screamed as they ripped out a handful of her hair, my instincts kicked in harder. Together, we pushed back against the door, trying to hold it shut even though every jolt felt like it might tear it from the hinges. It seemed impossible that we could survive it. The moonlight, those fragments of cold, silvery light slipping through the widening cracks in the door, felt like a countdown to something even worse than the horror already surrounding us. But then, after all the desperate struggling, the assault stopped. First, the chanting grew quieter. Then there was silence, almost too sudden to believe. My pulse was still racing in my ears, and even though everything around us had quieted, I couldn't trust it. Could it really be over? There was a knock at the door, and Lonnie and I held our breath. "Scusa me, you're doing all right in there?" It was Benny, the homeless man who had sometimes slept near the store. He was a familiar face, and his voice pulled us from the darkness of our panic. Slowly, cautiously, Lonnie and I opened the door and stepped out into the ruins of the store. The attackers were gone, leaving behind nothing but a black ash covering the ground, the air still tinged with the sharp stench of ammonia and sulfur. Broken windows and doors framed the destruction. That there were no bodies, just those strange traces in the ash, as though something or someone had dragged their feet before simply disappearing. The memory of stepping through that mess out into the cool night air has never left me. There were still blue petals from the flower display stuck to my shoes, a vivid reminder of the life and beauty that had existed before this nightmare took over. The police arrived minutes later, but there was no sign of the strange man. No bodies, no suspects. The night was written off as a riot, and despite everything, despite the blood and the violence, no one was ever arrested or charged. No murder investigation followed. No justice for the broken lives left in the aftermath. For a long time, Lonnie and I avoided talking about that night. It was too painful, too confusing, but one day, out of nowhere, she sent me a link. It was a video compilation of strange and eerie events caught on camera. Our store that very night was part of it. A few seconds of grainy footage showed those strangers breaking into the store, but none of the terror that came after. Somehow, our nightmare had become just another piece of online content for people to watch, share, and forget. I guess that's why I'm telling you this now. Some things are more than they seem. You can watch a clip or read a story and think you've seen it all, but sometimes behind that brief moment of strangeness is something far more terrifying. Something you can't begin to understand until you're in it. So the next time you see something weird online, take a step back, think, really look. Because sometimes what's captured in those short seconds isn't even the half of it. I've always struggled with sleep. Since childhood, sleep paralysis has plagued me a few times a year. On top of that, I suffer from exploding head syndrome (EHS), a bizarre phenomenon where you hear loud noises just as you're falling asleep or waking up. That unsettling mix is something I've dealt with at least once a month, making sleep feel like a constant battle. But things took a darker turn during a particularly rough time in my life. My mental health had deteriorated significantly, and with it, the frequency of my sleep paralysis and EHS episodes surged. It got to the point where I was experiencing sleep paralysis nearly every week, sometimes multiple times. I was desperate. I tried medication, but it barely made a dent. In fact, if anything, the episodes seemed to intensify. I felt trapped, as though no solution would ever work. But that was just the beginning of my ordeal. I've always had a fascination with the paranormal. The idea of something existing beyond our understanding was both thrilling and comforting. Death never scared me. It was just another mystery to be unraveled. But as my sleep issues grew worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister might be at play. I began to suspect that perhaps something paranormal was causing my sleep disturbances. In my desperation, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wanted to make contact with the spirit world. My hope was to either reach a guardian angel for protection or confront whatever entity was responsible for tormenting me. So I gathered what little I knew about conducting a ritual and set about trying to make contact with anything that could help. I'll admit, I wasn't as careful as I should have been. I skipped important precautions, like using salt circles or wearing protective pendants. I didn't really think I'd need them. I mean, nothing ever happened during my initial attempts at contact. I figured there was no harm in cutting a few corners. After a week of unsuccessful rituals, I decided to stop. Surprisingly, my sleep improved almost immediately. For 6 blissful weeks, I slept soundly, without a single episode of sleep paralysis or EHS. It was as if my problems had vanished. But as soon as that 6th week ended, everything changed. I still remember the dream that started it all. In it, I was talking with friends, and they were warning me about a new paranormal entity that had emerged and was kidnapping people. They told me this creature resembled a yurei, a ghost from Japanese folklore. But this entity was different. It had no face, just a pitch-black void where its features should have been. Its body was amorphous, with flowing, tattered white clothing that drifted as it floated. Yet, it could also walk or even run when it wanted to. What stood out most were its massive claws, which it used to drag its victims from their beds. In the dream, I saw a video of the creature stalking one of its victims. I never saw how it ended, but the warning was clear. You must keep your eyes shut. As soon as you opened them and saw it, that would be the end. Suddenly the dream shifted, and I found myself cradling a small child, maybe a younger version of myself or a son. I was comforting him, telling him to keep his eyes shut, no matter how terrifying the monster might seem. I assured him that as long as his eyes stayed closed, he would be safe. Then I woke up. At first, everything seemed normal. But then I heard footsteps, fast, heavy footsteps, heading straight toward me. My heart pounded, and I immediately remembered the dream. I clamped my eyes shut, my breath quickening, and that's when I heard it, a scream. An ear-piercing, blood-curdling scream of a woman, so loud and close that it felt like it was right inside my skull. The scream circled around me, changing direction, moving as if the entity from my dream was floating around, trying to overwhelm me. I wanted to open my eyes to look, but I didn't. I kept them shut tight, just as I had told the child in my dream. The screaming went on for what felt like an eternity, and then suddenly I blacked out. When I woke up the next morning, everything felt surreal. I was shaken but relieved that it had all been a dream. I told myself that nothing I experienced had been real, just a vivid nightmare brought on by stress. But then I noticed something strange. My abdomen started to itch. I lifted my shirt, and there they were, huge claw marks, red and raw, as if something had raked its nails across my skin. My heart sank as I stared at the wounds. The moment I acknowledged them, a sharp, burning pain shot through my body. The pain lasted for about 30 minutes, but it eventually faded. Even so, the reality of those marks shook me to my core. Since that night, I haven't had any more sleep paralysis episodes or EHS. My sleep has returned to normal, for which I'm thankful. But every time I look at those scars, I can't help but wonder if it really was just a dream. Something left those marks on me, and I'm not sure I want to know what it was. I try to reassure myself that it was all in my head, that my mind played a cruel trick on me. But deep down, I know those claw marks tell a different story. Lean and I have been having a bit of a problem lately, and it's only getting worse. Every night, right at 1:01 a.m., there's a knock on our window. Here's why I think it's spiraling out of control. The first time it happened, I woke up in the middle of the night, groggy, and reaching for the glass of water I keep on my nightstand. That's when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint but distinct. I glanced at the clock, 1:01 a.m. It felt strange, but I was too tired to care. Maybe it was the wind or a neighbor, I thought. I shifted in bed, and the tapping got faster. Tap, tap, tap. Annoyed, I shrugged it off, roll over, and fell back asleep. By morning, it was just a fleeting memory, forgotten in the blur of daily life. The next night, though, it happened again. Only this time, Lean was the one to notice. She shook me awake, her voice a panicked whisper in my ear. "Babe, babe, wake up," I groaned, half-conscious. What's wrong?" Her eyes were wide with fear. "Someone's tapping at the window," she whispered, pointing toward the curtain. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon sneaking in through the gap between the curtains. I was about to tell her she was imagining things when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I looked at the clock, 1:01 a.m. Exactly like the night before, the tapping was rhythmic, as if someone was lightly tapping their fingernail against the glass. The room felt too quiet, and my heart began to race. I didn't want to believe it, but the tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. There was a pause, and I felt my pulse quicken. After what seemed like forever, I built up enough courage to get out of bed and approach the window. Each step felt like an eternity, my feet heavy with dread. Thoughts of terrifying things, shadowy figures, or creatures lurking outside flashed through my mind. But I forced myself to reach for the curtain. I yanked it back. Nothing. The street outside was deserted, bathed in the silver glow of the moon. There was no one out there except a fogged-up message scrawled on the window, quickly fading. I went in. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, it was gone. Maybe I imagined it, I thought, shaking my head. I turned back to Lean with a nervous smile. It's nothing, babe. Probably just the wind. She didn't look convinced, but she climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head. The next morning came and went uneventfully, though the tension between us lingered. By evening, it was raining lightly, and we settled in for another movie marathon on the couch. The rain had a calming effect, and soon we were both dozing off, but just as we drifted into sleep, it came again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was barely audible over the soft pitter-patter of rain, but I knew it was the same knock. I lay still, pretending I didn't hear it, pulling Lean closer to me. The taps grew more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping the rain would drown it out, but the tapping only grew faster. Somehow I managed to fall asleep. The following morning, Lean handed me a cup of coffee, her eyes searching mine. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, trying to act normal, but the events of the past 2 nights weighed on me. As darkness fell again, we both braced ourselves, and right on time, at 1:01 a.m., tap, tap, tap. This time I didn't hesitate. I stood up, quietly walked to the kitchen, and grabbed a knife. Lean shook her head, but I was determined to confront whatever was out there. I approached the window cautiously, the knife trembling in my hand. Every step I took was met with a tap on the glass, mimicking my movements. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. I was just feet from the window when I saw it, a silhouette, framed by the moonlight. It looked like a head, but before I could make out any features, it vanished. That's when the scratching started. A sharp, piercing sound of nails scraping across the glass. It was unbearable. I dropped the knife, covering my ears as the screeching grew louder and louder. Lean was crouched behind the couch, hands over her ears too, eyes wide with terror. The scratching was relentless, accompanied by the rapid tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was everywhere, coming from the windows, the walls, even inside the room. I yanked the curtain back. Nothing again. But there was something bloody, handprints smeared across the glass, deep scratches running along the surface as if claws had tried to tear through. Lean was trembling, her voice shaking as she whispered, "I don't want to stay here anymore." I pulled her close, trying to reassure her, but I wasn't sure myself. How could this happen? We live on the 10th floor, for God's sake. There was no fire escape, no ledge for someone to stand on. Yet the blood was fresh. Morning couldn't come fast enough, and I convinced Lean to stay at her friend's place while I checked out the apartment. That night I sat near the window, baseball bat in hand, waiting. Hours passed. No tapping. I laughed to myself, thinking I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a prank. But then my phone rang. It was Leane. Double quotes Bryce. Bryce, it's here. It's tapping. Her voice was panicked, and I could hear it, the faint, Tap, tap, tap in the background. My heart dropped. Come get me, Bryce, please. I'm scared. I grabbed my keys, ready to rush out the door, but then she said something strange. Open the window. What? I froze. Lean. What do you mean, open the window? There was a low growl on the other end, followed by a voice that wasn't hers, a dark, distorted voice. Open the window, Bryce. Let me in. The tapping intensified. The window shook, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The door rattled violently, the glass shattered, and I heard a deep, guttural sound like something was grinding glass. With its teeth dot by the time Lean found me, I was a sobbing mess, curled up in a ball, drenched in sweat and tears. The apartment was in ruins, glass shattered, bloody handprints on the walls, deep claw marks running along the ceiling. I don't know what was out there that night, but it stripped me of every ounce of courage I had. Now I avoid apartments, especially ones with windows. Some knocks you just don't answer. I doubt anyone reading this will be old enough to remember when the boys from Winstead went missing in the Welsh mountains. Their story of being found 2 weeks after a motorbike accident where Willie lost his leg briefly became national news and made my grandfather, Arthur Trevelyan, and his best friend, one-legged William Chambers, local celebrities. After the media attention faded away, they lived a normal life in the village. They were regulars at their local pub, and if one came to the barmaid would pour to pints, knowing the other would soon follow. A strange tradition developed between them. Every New Year's Eve at midnight, Willie would remove his prosthetic leg, and Arthur would fill the socket with beer. They would both drink to their health, celebrating life in a way only they could understand. Both started businesses, married, had kids, and later divorced, eventually living alone. Arthur passed away recently, just a month after William's death. They both suffered heart attacks, perhaps just another thing they did together. They say you shouldn't speak ill of the dead, and I do not intend to, but I believe the truth must be told. So here I am, ready to reveal the real story of what happened the night Willie lost his leg. It was the summer of 1972. William and Arthur were taken on a summer trip with the Winstead Youth Club from the flat fenlands of eastern England to the Brecon Beacons in Wales. The landscape couldn't have been more different from what they knew, with its steep green valleys, roaring waterfalls, and rugged mountains. The boys stayed in a mountain hostel, and both were thrilled. At 18, they were yearning for freedom and adventure. They had a reputation for mischief, and were often referred to as a pair of little shits. After a morning of hiking and raft-making, the group returned to the hostel for the afternoon. William had a passion for motorbikes, especially his beat-up 50cc dirt bike back home, a clunky piece of machinery he loved more than anything. When he saw the brand-new royal blue 175cc Honda Scrambler parked outside the hostel office, he was obsessed. It was, to him, an alien machine, a work of art. Arthur remembered him describing it in awe, saying, all the way from Japan. That night, William decided he had to ride it. He and Arthur snuck out while everyone slept. They found the bike's keys in a jacket hanging in the office. Silent as shadows, they wheeled the bike away from the hostel, and once they were out of sight, Willie started it up. He hopped on with Arthur riding pillion, and they tore off into the night. They rode through the twisting mountain roads, the Honda's yellow headlight barely cutting through the darkness. Eventually they left the tarmac and found themselves on gravel tracks. It was on one of these turns, a sweeping right, that the front wheels slipped. The bike crashed to the ground with a sickening crunch, sparks flying as it slid across the gravel before disappearing over the edge of the road. Willie and Arthur tumbled after it, their skin scraping the rough ground, leaving blood behind as they fell into the cold night. According to Arthur, when he came to, he was battered but conscious. Willie, on the other hand, was in worse shape. His leg had been mangled in the fall, and by some cruel twist of fate, it had been torn off below the knee. Arthur did what he could. He made a tourniquet from his belt and wrapped Willie's wound, using his clothes to stop the bleeding. They had fallen deep into a valley far from the road. Days passed. They had no food, no way of signaling for help. Arthur searched for water, which he found in a nearby stream, and used it to keep Willie alive. He even tried catching rabbits by hand. Though weak and injured, he was only able to catch one or two. With nothing but a sharp stone to work with, he sliced the meat into slithers and fed what little Willie could stomach. After about 2 weeks, a small fire Arthur managed to start with the remnants of the motorbike's fuel was spotted by rescuers. They were found just in time to save Willie's life. Arthur was hailed as a hero, and despite their confession of stealing the motorbike, charges weren't pressed. The incident faded into the past. Willie lost his leg, but they both returned to Winstead, went on with their lives, and remained the closest of friends. When Willie died, the entire village mourned. He had become a beloved figure in the community, despite his rebellious youth. He had always been kind to my family, paying me more than I deserved when I worked in his garage, and even supporting me financially when I went off to university. He owed a debt of gratitude to my grandfather, and by extension, to me. But when Willie died, something in Arthur broke. He started having night terrors. At first, I thought it was just his grief, maybe early Alzheimer's. But he insisted it was something more. He told me he was seeing Willie young, blooded, and confused, hopping through his bedroom door, demanding, "Where is my leg?" Every morning, Arthur would scrub his door frame clean, obsessively wiping away the red smears Willie left behind in his nocturnal visits. Arthur was fading. The man who had always been strong, always quick to laugh, was breaking apart. Then, on what turned out to be his last morning, Arthur finally confessed the truth. Sitting on the edge of his bed, sobbing, he told me it was all true, except for the rabbits. I was confused at first. Why lie about something like that? But then he continued, we had nothing to eat. Willie was dying, and I couldn't catch anything. There were no rabbits, but in the stream I found it, cold and fresh. What did you find? I asked, though I already felt the dread building. Arthur looked at me, his face full of shame. His leg. That night, Arthur passed away in his sleep. I found him the next morning. There was no blood on the door frame this time, but somehow I knew it wasn't over. Willie had come for him, and now they were together again. Perhaps, after all these years, the weight of that grim choice was too much for my grandfather to bear. He had done what he had to do to survive, but that choice had haunted him ever since. So, judge him if you will, but know this. Arthur saved his friend's life in the only way he could. They loved each other like brothers, and I choose to believe that in the end Willie forgave him. They left this world together, just as they had always done, everything side by side. When I cleaned Arthur's room that day, I saw something strange on the door frame. It wasn't Arthur's blood. There are many small towns in the United States that hold strange urban legends, like Thornton, Colorado's Riverdale Road. The residents of this quiet hamlet eagerly share the eerie tales about the road's history, how the KKK once held rituals in the woods nearby, and how if you drive down it at night, you might see the ghost of a woman in white or the haunting apparitions of lynched slaves swaying from the trees. While many of these local legends can't be proven, I have one story that I can't shake off, a story that changed my life forever. Before I went to college, I had never left the southern coast of South Carolina. My father, my brother, and I lived in a small trailer home about 20 minutes from Edisto Beach. My dad worked as a fisherman, spending most of his days out on the water, leaving before dawn and coming home late at night. Sundays were the only days we had with him, and we would spend those afternoons swimming at the beach. As the sun set, we'd hop on the airboat and either relax or go frog gigging, a peaceful end to a good day. Life wasn't extravagant, but we didn't need much to be happy. Then everything changed after a tropical storm hit. The story begins with my dad's perspective, out at sea, working his long hours aboard the fishing trawler. That night the waves were unusually rough, stirring unease within him. It wasn't long before he received a tropical storm warning through the radio. He hurriedly ordered his crew to pull in the nets and gather inside the superstructure. However, when he stepped outside, he was surprised to see the deckhands had already hauled in the nets. Typically, it took them a lot longer to do so, but they were standing frozen, staring out towards the ocean. One of them pointed into the distance, trying to scream something over the crashing waves. Following the man's outstretched finger, my dad squinted, trying to understand what had paralyzed his crew. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the horizon. In that moment, he saw it clear as day. A massive creature had just risen out of the ocean. Water cascaded off its gray, wrinkled, leather-like skin. It towered hundreds of feet above the waves, even with its lower body submerged. It had for arms two large and two smaller-end ivory claws that seemed as big as their trawler. Its back was covered in massive scutes the size of cars, but the most terrifying feature was its head. A narrow, blade-like spike extended from its forehead, and its lipless mouth displayed rows of teeth, each the size of a man. Its eyes, glowing a piercing blue, bore a look of sheer hatred. My dad stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Then, snapping out of it, he screamed for the crew to get inside the bridge. Once inside, he ordered the skipper to head for shore as fast as possible. The skipper didn't ask any questions. He simply increased the throttle and adjusted the helm. But as my dad turned for one last glance at the monster, the crew heard an ear-splitting roar that echoed over the waves. It was followed by a deep, primal growl that rumbled like the engine of the boat itself. As they made their way back to shore, the boat was suddenly rocked, as if something gigantic had brushed against it. My dad braced himself, thinking the creature had attacked, but as quickly as it came, the boat stabilized. Whatever the thing was, it hadn't tried to harm them. It had only cleared a path for itself, a path that led straight to shore. Meanwhile, back on the creek, I was out with a friend, a fellow junior in high school. He had recently gotten the keys to his family's boat as a birthday gift and had been eager to take it for a spin. We decided to head out before sunset, but unfortunately we lost track of time and ended up stuck on the water after dark. The only light guiding us back was the small beacon from the marina and faint house lights along the shore. The rain began softly at first, but soon it grew more intense. My friend cursed under his breath as we tried to find our way back. All I could think about was how furious my dad would be if he found out I had snuck out on a school night. At exactly 12:49 a.m., the creature made landfall. We finally reached the main bay, the marina's light a beacon of hope. My friend sighed in relief as he turned toward the dock, but then we saw them two glowing blue orbs high in the sky above the beach. At first I thought it might be a helicopter, but there was no sound of blades cutting through the air. All I could hear was the steady hum of our boat's motor and the faint crash of waves. Then it roared. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, a deep, guttural sound that began like an alligator's growl and grew into an ear-shattering bellow. It was the sound of something not of this earth. I instinctively knew the roar was coming from those blue lights, though I couldn't comprehend how or why. My friend cut the engine as we both stared in shock. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the air felt heavy with something more than just the storm. In the distance, we heard booming sounds, almost like explosions, in time with the advancing blue orbs. And then, in a blinding flash of lightning, we saw it, the creature, the same towering monster that my father had described. Its four massive arms stretched out in front of it, its blade-shaped head pointed toward the sky, and its jaw still open, emitting that terrible roar. It was moving inland, each booming footstep shaking the ground, the houses and trees below it insignificant compared to its colossal size. For what felt like an eternity, we sat in stunned silence. My friend began muttering obscenities, unable to grasp what we had just witnessed. We were frozen in place, and even after the creature's glowing blue eyes faded into the distance, we were too terrified to move. We turned off the boat's motor and waited, sitting in the darkness, unsure if the beast would return. Neither of us slept that night. When the sun finally rose, we cautiously made our way back to the marina, where my dad and my friend's parents were waiting for us. But instead of the scolding we expected, there was only relief. They had seen it too. They knew the storm had brought something with it, something that wasn't meant to be part of this world. To this day, only a handful of people who were there that night ever speak about what happened. The destruction left in the creature's fate could be blamed on the storm, and its massive footprints quickly disappeared in the mud. There was no evidence left to prove what we had witnessed. We never talked about it. We just tried to forget. But every time it storms, I can't help but sit by the window, waiting for those blue eyes to return, looming in the darkness above the beach. I'm home for the summer now, back in Edisto, and though I love the beach, the fresh seafood, and spending time with my family, I can never truly relax here anymore. Not after what I saw. I'm writing this tonight because there's another storm warning, and I can't sleep. I need to know if anyone else has seen this creature anywhere on the coast, or even anywhere in the world. If you have, please let me know. I just need to know. I'm not alone in this. I've loved going to garage and estate sales since I was a kid. Every item being sold has a story connected to it, and I love discovering what might be hiding behind people's unwanted junk. From grandfather clocks to old military uniforms, to even a nearly mint-condition Model T that someone's relative had kept secret from the family. I found hundreds of items like that. So one day, when I came upon a small neighborhood garage sale, I quickly pulled my car into this unfamiliar neighborhood and began searching. I found the usual odd knickknacks people try to get rid of, clothes, old electronics, and an odd piece of furniture here and there. I bought a few items, but nothing stood out. That was until I came upon an elderly woman sitting in front of her house with a few items laid out before her. She smiled as I walked over, and we struck up a conversation. She began showing me what she had for sale. I don't have to tell you how big of a jackpot old people can be when it comes to interesting items. She explained she was about to move into a nursing home and had to give up some items she couldn't take with her. As I nodded and browsed, Something caught my weathered old journal, tightly tied up with a leather strap, with photographs sticking out. I picked it up and examined it, but didn't want to be rude by opening it in front of her. I asked her about the book, and she took it from me, trying to look at it through her impressively thick glasses. It seemed as foreign to her as it did to me. With the leather-wrapped mystery in hand, I gave the elderly woman, Margaret, my number just in case anything came up about the journal. Then, with childlike excitement, I hurried home to examine my find. The first thing that greeted me when I opened the journal was a weathered photo of 5 heavily jacketed men standing in what appeared to be a vast white void. I flipped the photo over, and an inscription on the back caught me off guard. Antarctic Expedition, July 1930. I'm no expert on Antarctic expeditions, but I'd never heard of one from the 1930s. A quick Google search confirmed that Admiral Richard E. Byrd had led an Antarctic expedition in 1930. But before I got my hopes up, I realized none of the men in the photo resembled Byrd. In fact, the date on the photo was from a month after Byrd's expedition had returned home. I plucked another photo from the journal. It was another image of the 5 men, but this one was labeled with their names: Professor Albert Woodring, Niles Bergsvik, Olaf Husted, Jesse Wallace, and Henry Perkins. With names now attached to these mystery explorers, I started searching for them. But I came up empty. There was nothing connected to these men, not even for the professor. Thinking this might be some sort of hoax or a setup for a story, I cracked open the journal and started reading. It became apparent that the journal belonged to Henry Perkins, a university student, though he never mentioned which one. Much of the early journal detail the build-up toward the Antarctic expedition. Apparently, 3 Americans, including the professor and Henry, were joined by 2 Norwegians hired to help them survive the harsh Antarctic conditions. They planned to set up a base camp after traveling across the Transantarctic Mountains deep into the icy wasteland. One early entry in the journal stood out to me. March 17, 1930. I spoke with Professor Woodring today about the finances of this expedition. This amount of equipment must be costing both him and the university a small fortune. Not only are we bringing a team of sled dogs and enough provisions for up to 3 years, but we also have a wireless telegraph machine. I would guess this expedition rivals Admiral Byrd's, but the professor has kept tight-lipped about where the money is coming from. He vaguely mentioned a French nobleman financing most, if not all, of the costs. Perkins seemed as skeptical as I was. Funding an expedition of this magnitude during the Great Depression would have been an enormous challenge. The secrecy surrounding the expedition also seemed strange. By the time they set sail for Antarctica, only 30 men had been selected. The doubts I had about this being real continued to linger, but Perkins' writing was captivating. Despite the strange circumstances, he was thrilled to be part of this journey. He wrote with excitement about leaving the university and making his mark on history. Their ship, the SS Firefly, arrived off the coast of Antarctica after a month of smooth sailing. Perkins' excitement was evident in his writing. June 27, 1930. At long last, we've arrived. The great white land is before us, and I've never been more excited. I'm about to walk where only a few brave souls had tread before. The men are all giddy with excitement, and I share in their anticipation. Though Professor Woodring seems a bit muted in his enthusiasm, I suppose a war veteran is hard to impress. After reaching Antarctica, the team began unloading and setting up their base camp near Mount Erebus, which they named Atlas Camp, a nod to the Titan that holds up the world. The rest of June and July were spent constructing the camp amidst blizzards and harsh winds. Despite the conditions, Perkins seemed undeterred. He even struck up a friendship with Niles, one of the Norwegians. They bonded over a shared love of art, exchanging sketches of each other, which I found tucked between the journal's pages. By August, the base camp was completed, and they settled in to wait out the Antarctic winter, which I later learned lasts from March to October. Perkins documented this time well, with several photos of the team maintaining high morale as they cared for the sled, dogs, and collected fossils and samples. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until a peculiar incident shook the men. I'll let Perkins describe it. September 27th, 1930. The most peculiar incident occurred last night, leaving us stumped and confused. I was up late taking notes on a trilobite fossil Jesse had discovered when I heard a loud and sickening crash on the roof of our cabin. The noise was so great it woke almost everyone instantly. Olaf and Niles were quick to their feet, grabbing their shotguns from the wall. I had to stop anyone from venturing outside until dawn, for in these sub-zero temperatures, and with the storm raging, we risked becoming lost. November 24th, 1930 continued. I trudged through the snow, battling the cold and wind. Following the faint echoes of the screams, I felt panic tightening in my chest as the screams grew clearer, more desperate. Eventually, I stumbled upon Jesse Wallace's tent, its entrance flapping violently in the wind. The snow had partially filled it, and inside it was empty. I called out for Jesse, but only the wind answered. I rushed back to the others, bursting into Niles and Olaf's tent. Jesse's gone, I shouted over the wind. Their faces went pale, and we quickly roused the professor and began to search for him. Despite the raging storm, we couldn't ignore the possibility that Jesse had wandered out and gotten lost. We split into pairs, with Olaf and Niles going one way, and the professor and me heading in another. We scoured the area surrounding the camp, calling Jesse's name, but our voices were swallowed by the wind. After what felt like hours of searching, Niles and Olaf returned, empty-handed and shaken. They reported finding footprints leading out into the snow, but abruptly stopping several hundred meters from camp. December 1st, 1930. A week has passed since Jesse's disappearance. We have found no trace of him. The blizzard lasted for 2 days, and when it finally cleared, all we found were more strange footprints in the snow. They weren't Jesse's. These were larger, far larger than any human or animal we knew of. They seemed almost reptilian. Niles and Olaf, usually the most resilient of our group, have become increasingly on edge. They whisper about something stalking us, something in the white expanse beyond our camp. At first I dismissed it as paranoia, but I cannot deny the strange occurrences. Every night since Jesse vanished, we've heard strange noises, low growls, and strange scraping sounds coming from the direction where we found the eggs. The professor has taken to keeping a loaded revolver by his side at all times. December 5th, 1930. Last night, something tried to break into my tent. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing just outside, followed by slow, deliberate scraping along the canvas. For a moment I thought it was one of the others, perhaps trying to play a cruel joke, but when I called out, the breathing grew louder, more aggressive. I grabbed my lamp and, with trembling hands, lit it. The glow revealed a dark silhouette against the tent wall, tall and hunched, its outline barely visible in the faint light. I held my breath as it lingered for a moment longer before retreating into the snow. I ran to the others, who were already wide awake, clutching their weapons. The same thing had happened to them. We gathered in the professor's tent, unsure of what to do. The professor, usually a man of reason and logic, looked as shaken as the rest of us. He suggested we pack up and leave in the morning, abandoning the expedition. None of us objected. December 7th, 1930. We're trapped. Another blizzard hit just as we were preparing to leave, worse than the last. The winds are howling relentlessly, and the temperature has plummeted. We've huddled together in the professor's tent, trying to conserve heat and maintain some semblance of sanity. But something is out there, watching us. We can hear it at night, circling the camp, occasionally scratching at the tents or letting out strange, guttural sounds that none of us can identify. Niles is convinced it's whatever laid those eggs we found. He's been muttering about ancient creatures, things that existed long before humans ever set foot on this frozen continent. At first I thought he was losing his mind, but now I'm not so sure. December 10th, 1930. Tolov is gone. Sometime in the night, while the rest of us were sleeping, something came for him. His tent was ripped open from the outside, and there was so much blood trailing off into the snow. We searched for hours, but there was no body, no sign of him other than the mangled tent and the crimson-stained snow. We're down to 3 now. The professor has become almost catatonic, staring into the fire with hollow eyes. Niles has started talking to himself, muttering in Norwegian, pacing around the camp like a caged animal. I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. I keep seeing shadows moving just beyond the firelight, shapes that disappear the moment I turn to look at them. December 12th, 1930. I don't know how much longer we can survive out here. The food is running low, and the constant fear of whatever is out there has worn us down. Niles disappeared last night, just like Jesse and Olaf. One moment he was sitting by the fire, and the next he was gone. I found his hatchet lying in the snow, but there was no sign of him. It's just me and the professor now, and he's stopped responding to anything I say. He just sits there, staring out into the whiteness, as if waiting for something or someone to come for him. December 15th, 1930. I don't know if anyone will ever find this journal. I don't know if anyone will ever know what happened to us out here. The professor is gone. He walked out into the snow last night without a word, and I didn't stop him. Maybe I should have, but I'm too tired, too afraid. I can hear it now, whatever it is, just outside the tent. It's been circling for hours, waiting for me to make a move. I can feel its presence, feel its hunger. I don't know what it is, but I know it's not human. Maybe it never was. This will be my final entry. I'm going to face whatever it is. If anyone finds this journal, please tell my family what happened. Tell them we weren't alone out here. There's something in the Antarctic, something old, something hungry. I sat in stunned silence, the journal still open in my hands. The last page was smudged, the handwriting barely legible, but the message was clear. Whatever had happened to Henry Perkins and his companions was something beyond explanation, something terrifying. I quickly closed the journal and placed it back in its leather wrap, my hands shaking. The Antarctic was a place of desolation and mystery, but this was something else entirely. Whatever those men had encountered out there, I had no doubt that it was real, and it was still out there, buried under the ice, waiting. January 1931. We are near the summit of the mountain pass now, and I'm not sure how much longer we can go on. Niles' infection is worsening, and he's lost too much blood. He barely responds to me now, his body fighting a battle that I fear is already lost. I've had to drag the sled alone for most of the journey, the biting wind and cold gnawing at my exposed skin like tiny knives. The weight of our dwindling supplies, the dead, and the creature that stalks us weighs heavily on my soul. Every night I hear it in the distance, that terrible buzzing sound. Sometimes I feel like I can hear the professor's desperate cries mixed in with the wind, as if he's out there somewhere, trapped in a hellish eternity of being hunted by the beast. I know it's madness, but in the isolation, reality begins to blur with imagination. My thoughts drift between survival and the endless snow. Sometimes I think it would be easier to lie down and let the cold take me. We found a small cave near the summit to take shelter for the night. Niles is barely breathing now. His face is pale, eyes sunken and glassy. I doubt he'll survive the night, but I have no choice but to keep moving. My only hope is to reach the base and send help before the creature claims the last of us. I fear that even if I survive this, my mind will never return from the brink. January 9th, 1931. Niles died during the night. His breath grew shallow until it stopped altogether. I wrapped his body in the sled's tarp and left it behind. There is nothing I can do for him now. I took his revolver and the last of our food. I will continue alone. I've seen movement in the snow, but I cannot be sure if it's the creature or my own paranoia. Every time I glance behind me, I swear I see shadows darting just out of sight. I have 4 bullets left. 2 for the creature, 2 for me if it comes to that. January 13th, 1931. I can see Atlas Base in the distance. I've made it to the other side of the mountains. It feels like a hallucination, but there it is, faint but real, the dark speck of humanity against the endless white wasteland. My hands are shaking too much to write properly, but I need to record this. I know the creature is still following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I've been hearing the buzzing again, louder now, like it's close. I have no strength left to fight. My legs are numb, my body is on the verge of collapse. But I will make it back. I have to make it back. If I can just reach the base, I'll be safe. January 15th, 1931. I write this final entry as I lay in the snow, the base so close yet out of reach. The creature struck again during the night. I managed to wound it with the revolver, but it's still out there, lurking, waiting. I can feel it in the wind, in the snow beneath me. I don't have any strength left. My vision is fading, the cold seeping into my bones. If anyone finds this journal, know that there is something out here, something that was never meant to be found. We unearthed it, and now we pay the price. The eggs, the creature, none of it was natural. It's ancient, primal, and it won't stop until we are all gone. God help me. I hear it buzzing again. This was Perkins' final entry. The journal was found near the remains of Atlas Base, along with the bodies of the expedition team. There was no sign of the creature, but rumors of strange noises and unexplained disappearances continue to haunt the area. The true nature of what they uncovered in the Antarctic interior remains a chilling mystery to this day. January 10th, 1931. Niles is dead. He went as far as he could, but at last the infection caught up with him, along with his snow blindness. I stayed with him through the night in our bivouac as he slowly drifted away. His stories of childhood, his wife, and the life he once had filled the silence. But his voice grew weaker until finally he ceased to be. His last words were in Norwegian, and I couldn't understand them, but they carried the weight of a farewell. I buried Niles as best as I could, fashioning a grave from his skis and any equipment I could spare. There was no grand gesture, no ceremonial goodbye. It was just me, the cold, and the endless snow, the final witness to a life lost in the frozen wasteland. I made a simple sketch of the grave, not for anyone to see but for me, so I could feel that I had done something to honor him. It seems almost futile now. Now I am alone. The next few entries in Henry Perkins' journal are a descent into madness. His writing becomes erratic, words scrolled and fragmented, barely legible. It's as if the cold was not only freezing his body, but also eating away at his sanity. But from what few fragments I could piece together, it's clear that the relentless pursuit by the creature was taking its toll. Creature attacked again, stung with its stinger, managed to hit it with an ice axe, cut off one of its antennae. Saving bullets, pain is unbearable. Must keep going the pain Perkins must have felt, alone and wounded, with nothing but a dwindling supply of food and bullets, is unimaginable. But it seems even in his delirium he had moments of clarity. He noticed the creature's antennae poking out of the snow, using them to sense him. Somehow, in his weakened state, he managed to evade it at least for a time. Blizzard is upon me, bivouacked in place. Can hear it near me. For days the storm battered him, trapping him in place. There is no clear timeline here, but it seems like the blizzard raged for days, keeping him locked in his tent, fighting to survive against both the storm and the creature lurking just outside. The food has run out. Blizzard continues. When the storm finally cleared, Perkins could see the Camp Atlas base from where he was, but by then he could no longer move his legs. Frostbite had set in, leaving him unable to walk, and just beyond his reach the creature waited, as if it knew he had no strength left to flee. His final entry is the most heartbreaking of all. After everything he had endured, after surviving so much, he was within sight of salvation yet. It was too far. Fired several shots at the creature. It screamed, ran away, left behind an egg. It's a female, I believe. I wonder if anyone heard my shots. I believe I'll rest a moment before trying to move my legs again. Just a small race, and that's where his entries end. Perkins was so close. Just a short distance from the safety of Atlas Base. He succumbed to his injuries and exhaustion. His journey was over. But how did his journal, with its tragic and terrifying tale, end up in the hands of Margaret, the elderly woman, at the garage sale? This was the question that haunted me as I closed the journal for the final time. I decided to contact Margaret again, to tell her about the journal's contents and ask her more about her great-grandfather. To my surprise, she suddenly remembered something, a story her great-grandfather had told her long ago. He had been part of an Antarctic expedition, one that had helped build and maintain Atlas Base. Her great-grandfather hadn't gone with the main expedition, but he had been the base. When Henry Perkins fired those final, desperate shots, she invited him back to her home to see more of her great-grandfather's possessions. When I arrived, she produced several old, weathered photographs. There was no mistaking it. These were photos from that very expedition. Her great-grandfather had been there, part of the team at Atlas Base. From what we could piece together, it seemed that after Perkins had fired his shots, Margaret's great-grandfather and a few other men had gone to investigate. They found his body, along with the journal. The eggs, the creature, none of it was ever officially documented, perhaps out of fear or disbelief. But the journal had survived, passed down through her family. It seemed clear to me now Perkins' story was real, and I wasn't the only one who believed it. While doing more research, I was contacted by a man named Jackson LeBlanc, a descendant of Henry LeBlanc, the financier of the original expedition. Jackson was eager to purchase the journal, offering me any price I named. He was fascinated by the discovery and convinced that it validated his ancestors' theories about life in the Antarctic. I'm meeting Jackson tomorrow. He's eager to see the journal for himself, and I have no doubt that he'll pay handsomely for it. But as I sit here, contemplating the events I've uncovered, I can't shake the feeling that maybe this journal wasn't meant to be found. That perhaps there are some things in this world, some creatures better left undiscovered. Something was living in the Antarctic, something ancient and deadly. Maybe it still is. But that's the end of my story. I told you. You do find those nuggets of gold in garage sales after all. The relentless rain soaks through my winter jacket as I stare down at the empty street, exhausted from searching for shelter. The biting cold seeps into my bones, and with every failed attempt to find cover, I realize that true comfort is as fleeting as spotting a taxi in a downpour. Hopeful at first, but gone before you can grasp it. With no other options, I spot a rusty fire escape ladder on an old apartment building. My right arm, weakened by old fractures, barely cooperates as I struggle to climb up. The icy sheets of rain whip against my jeans, soaking through the thick socks I've paired with my Crocs. I hope the rooftop will offer some respite, maybe a bench or an overhang to shield me from the freezing downpour. As I'm halfway up the ladder, a voice cuts through the darkness. Need a hand? Startled, I look down and see a strange man standing at the base of the ladder. His fur pants are soaked, and an odd stench of cologne, something like a mix of Tabasco sauce and animal musk, clings to the air around him. The cops are patrolling the area, he warns. You'll freeze or get arrested if you stay out here. I don't have many options, but I hesitate. This rooftop is my last hope for shelter. I can't afford to lose it. My arm aches as I try to pull myself higher, but the cold rain makes it impossible to grip the ladder properly. You can come with me, he says, stepping back into the dim light of the street lamp. He's slim, average height, with a face that seems unnervingly calm. I've got a place nearby. You'll be warm there. His appearance doesn't inspire much confidence, but I can't stand the idea of spending the night out here, exposed to the freezing rain. My arm is throbbing, and the thought of getting sick again pushes me over the edge. I climb down, eyeing him warily. I'm Jack, I lie, forcing a grin. You sure it's safe? He nods, introducing himself as John. My friends call me Mr. Poker Face, he adds, his tone flat, his face blank. It's unsettling, but at this point, I have little choice. I follow him to his apartment, a rundown building with dim hallways and a flickering light that casts eerie shadows on the walls. Inside, the apartment is small and cramped, shrouded in darkness. Power's out, he says nonchalantly, gesturing to the couch. You can rest here. I hesitate, but the lure of warmth and shelter is too strong. I sink into the lumpy cushions, accepting the thin blanket he offers. It's better than the rain-soaked streets. He hands me a glass of water, but something about him feels off. I don't drink it, just holding the glass in my hand as I try to relax. The sound of rain hitting the windows lulls me into a light doze, but then I hear a long, drawn-out wail from somewhere inside the apartment. My eyes snap open, heart racing. The noise is eerie, primal, and filled with pain. It sends chills down my spine. I sit up, trying to convince myself I imagined it. The room is still dark, the only light coming from a faint glow under the bathroom door. My eyes flick to the glass of water in my hand. I sniff it cautiously, but detect nothing strange. Reluctantly, I take a sip, then another. It tastes stale and metallic. As I set the glass down, the door to John's room creaks open. My breath catches as I watch him move across the room, his gait jerky and unnatural. He heads to the bathroom, closing the door behind him. A dim yellow light spills out from under the door. I need to leave. Something's wrong. I stand up slowly, careful not to make any noise. But as I head for the door, something catches my eye. I glance into John's room and feel my stomach drop. The walls are lined with mounted animal heads, their glassy eyes staring blankly at me. A thick fur blanket covers the bed, and on the floor I spot a coil of rope and a roll of duct tape. Panic surges through me. I throw on my jacket, struggling to get my right arm into the sleeve, my mind racing. Just as I'm about to reach for the door, John emerges from the bathroom, holding a long hammer in one hand and wearing latex gloves. "You stay right there," he says in a chilling monotone. "I won't kill you." I freeze, heart pounding, my mind scrambling for a way out. He steps closer, his expression as blank as ever. "I have more faces," he continues, his voice calm. "I'll show you my collection of human heads." Adrenaline floods my veins, and I bolt for the door. John swings the hammer, the blunt end slamming into the back of my head. Pain explodes in my skull, but my jacket absorbs most of the impact. I fumble with the lock, my right arm too weak to manage, but I wrench the door open with my left hand just as John's hammer swings again. Raising my neck, another blow strikes my temple, splitting the skin open. Blood pours down my face, but I shove past him, slipping through the door and into the hallway. I scream for help, but the building is silent, empty. On the street, headlights gleam in the distance. I run towards them, my lungs burning, my legs numb. I don't know if John is following me, but I don't look back. A car slows as I reach the curb, and the driver helps me call the police. When the officers arrive, they take me back to the apartment. I don't want to go, but they insist. Inside, everything looks pristine. The animal heads are still there, but there's no sign of the hammer, the rope, or the duct tape. John stands calmly in the corner, his expression unchanged. The police don't believe me. They find traces of drugs in my system, drugs I never took. They chalk it up to a delusion, a bad trip. John claims I had a breakdown, that he was only trying to help me. He walks away free. I'm left to nurse my wounds, my mind haunted by the memory of that night. The city feels colder, darker. Every shadow could be him, every stranger a threat. I don't know if John will come after me again, but I know one thing for sure: there's no one left to save me. The scene before me was impossible to comprehend. We stood on the edge of that ancient mezzanine, our flashlights casting weak beams that barely penetrated the gloom. The scale of the place was overwhelming, endless tiers of bookshelves, stretching beyond the limits of our sight, plunging deep into a chasm that had no discernible bottom. To look too long into that abyss was to feel as though the world might tilt and pull you in. It was a library that defied reason, stretching on forever, a place where time and space had twisted beyond recognition. My fellow explorers stood beside me, but we barely spoke. There was no need to voice what we were all thinking, that this place was wronged, deeply wrong, in a way we couldn't explain. I gripped my flashlight tighter, resisting the urge to glance over my shoulder. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something unseen was watching us from the darkness. But whenever I tried to focus on it, the feeling slipped away, like a fleeting shadow, at the edge of my vision. How far does it go? One of the scientists, a geologist named Harris, finally whispered, his voice shaky. "I don't think we want to know," I replied quietly, my voice barely above a murmur. It felt sacrilegious to speak too loudly here, as if we might disturb something ancient and terrible lurking in the shadows. Amber, the expedition's linguist, knelt by one of the shelves near the edge of the mezzanine. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books, her brow furrowed in concentration. These texts, they're written in languages I've never seen before. Some of them seem like ancient dialects, but others, they're completely alien, I crouched beside her, careful not to touch the books. "You're telling me this place could be older than we think, pre-human?" She nodded, her eyes darting nervously across the shelves. "It's possible. But what I don't understand is why books? Why would they store knowledge in a way we recognize? And how could something like this exist, hidden beneath the earth?" Before I could answer, a sudden, eerie sensation crawled down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone in feeling it. Harris turned sharply, sweeping his flashlight around, his breath quickening. Amber froze, her fingers hovering over the spine of a leather-bound tome, eyes wide with the same dread that now gripped me. "I don't like this," Harris muttered. "Feels like we're not alone." I stood, scanning the shelves around us. The books remained undisturbed, and there were no signs of movement. But that feeling, the oppressive weight of eyes on us, it wouldn't go away. "We need to keep moving," I said, trying to sound calm. "We don't want to get stuck in here." We began to walk, the floor beneath us echoing with our footsteps. Every step seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 eyes, all watching, all waiting. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently than I cared to admit, expecting to see something lurking between the shelves, something watching us from the darkened recesses of this impossible labyrinth. As we descended a narrow stone stairway carved into the rock, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in. The air grew thicker, hotter, as though we were descending deeper into the earth's core. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the books themselves exhaled an ancient, suffocating energy. Eventually, we reached another corridor, narrower than the first, the shelves pressing in on both sides. The books here were older, their spines cracked and decayed, some crumbling into dust at the slightest touch. I could hear Amber's breath quickening beside me as she scanned the titles, her fingers trembling. "There's something. I can almost make out a pattern," she muttered, pulling a book from the shelf. As soon as she did, the temperature around us seemed to plummet. A cold, biting wind swept through the corridor, though there was no apparent source. Amber gasped, dropping the book as though it had burned her. It hit the floor with a soft thud, kicking up a small cloud of dust. "What happened?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes wide, staring at the spot where the book had fallen. It's not just gibberish. I think these are names." Her voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. "Names of what?" Harris asked, stepping closer. "Not what," Amber whispered, her voice shaking. "Who? I think these are the names of the dead, millions of them." A chill settled over us, more palpable than the cold wind that had swept through the corridor. I looked down at the book Amber had dropped, the faint, ghostly script on its cover barely visible in the dim light. Something about it repelled me, an instinctive urge to step back, to leave it untouched. Yet I couldn't look away. The pages fluttered slightly, as though moved by a breeze we couldn't feel. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firmer now. The others nodded in agreement, the fear clear in their eyes. But as we turned to retrace our steps, the corridor behind us seemed to stretch impossibly, the way out distorted and twisted. The shelves loomed taller, more oppressive, their shadows swallowing what little light our flashlights offered. And then, from somewhere deep within the labyrinth of books, came the faintest sound, a whisper, a voice indistinct, but growing louder. It was calling our names. Dr. Bosenstein didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the open pages before him, fingers trembling as they hovered just above the text. His breathing had become shallow, erratic, and the beads of sweat now dripped from his chin onto the brittle paper beneath his hands. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, a creeping dread that slithered up my spine. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. I shot a glance at Bea, who was now on her feet, her earlier curiosity replaced with concern. "Grant, snap out of it," she called, louder this time, her voice echoing unnervingly off the shelves surrounding us. But Dr. Rosenstein's lips twitched as if trying to form words, though nothing came out. His eyes wide, glassy, and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place, flicked across the page in a frantic, desperate dance. It was as if he were trying to understand something his mind simply couldn't process. Lieutenant Meikle, the commanding officer of the soldiers, stepped forward, his hand reaching cautiously for the book in Rosenstein's lap. "Doc, I'm taking this away, okay? We're going to get you some fresh air." His voice was calm, practiced, the tone of a man who had probably talked comrades out of panic in war zones. As soon as his fingers touched the book's cover, Rosenstein jerked backward with a sudden, violent movement, knocking over the pile of books beside him. He clutched the tome to his chest, his mouth opening in a silent scream, eyes rolling back into his skull. "Grant!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet as panic surged through me. He let out a guttural, gasping sound, as if he couldn't get enough air into his lungs. His whole body convulsed, and his grip on the book tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Get that book out of his hands," Meikle ordered, his own calm now fraying at the edges. One of the soldiers, Corporal Baker, moved quickly, grabbing the spine of the book and pulling with all his strength. It was like trying to pry a child's favorite toy from their hands. Rosenstein's fingers were locked in a death grip, refusing to let go. Then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, I saw his eyes snap back into focus. He stared directly at me, no longer glassy or confused. His gaze was sharp and filled with something dark, something ancient. It was as if the man I'd known for years, the quiet, meticulous scientist, had been replaced by something else, something that wasn't human. His voice, when it finally came, was low and rasping, barely recognizable. "It wants you, it wants all of us." My blood ran cold. I backed away, heart pounding, unable to process the weight of his words. What the hell had he seen? What had he read in that damn book? Meikle, with a surge of force, yanked the book free from Rosenstein's grip, sending the scientist sprawling onto his back. The moment the book was out of his hands, Rosenstein's body went limp, his breathing slowing until it was shallow but steady. He looked spent, like a man who had just been through a waking nightmare, but that wasn't what drew my attention. The book, the cursed thing that had put him into this state, fell open on the ground, its pages fluttering softly in the cavern's unnatural wind. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to leave it alone, but my eyes were drawn to it, pulled as if by an invisible force. Symbols, twisted and alien, covered the pages, almost shifting as I stared at them. They seemed alive, pulsating, as if the ink itself was breathing. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the feeling that those symbols weren't just ink on paper. They were looking back at me. "It's not safe here," Meikle said, his voice cutting through the rising terror in my chest. "We're leaving." "Nah." No one argued. We scrambled to gather our things, leaving the scattered books where they lay. Rosenstein was conscious, but groggy, his eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Two of the soldiers lifted him under the arms and began dragging him back the way we had come. As we moved back through the narrow corridors of bookshelves, the oppressive atmosphere grew worse. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, and the feeling of being watched had intensified to the point where I could practically feel eyes crawling across my skin. And then came the whispers. They started soft, barely audible at first, just faint murmurs, but I convinced myself were nothing more than the sound of our own footsteps echoing in the massive space. but they grew louder, more distinct, dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, overlapping in a cacophony of words I couldn't understand. They were coming from the books, from the shelves, from the walls. I glanced at Bea, who was walking beside me, her face pale and drawn. "Do you hear that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, I hear it." Suddenly, Baker stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight beam jerking wildly as he whipped his head around. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. I followed his gaze and froze. Ahead of us, at the far end of the corridor, a shadow moved. Not a trick of the light, not a figment of my imagination. Something large and dark was moving between the shelves, just at the edge of our visibility. It glided silently, disappearing and reappearing as it wove through the labyrinth of books. "We need to move faster," Meikle said, his voice tight with barely contained fear. We picked up the pace, but it was too late. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, and the shadow behind us multiplied. More figures stole, impossibly thin and barely human, began to appear from the shelves. They glided soundlessly, their forms indistinct, but undeniably real. We broke into a run, the corridor ahead seeming to stretch endlessly before us. I could hear Rosenstein muttering again, his words slurred and incomprehensible, as the soldiers dragged him along. Behind us, the figures moved faster, closing the distance with an unnatural speed. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to keep up with the group, my legs burning with exhaustion. Just when I thought we wouldn't make it, a sliver of light appeared ahead, the entrance, our way out. We bolted toward it with everything we had, the whispers turning into a deafening roar, the shadows lunging forward as if they were about to swallow us whole. With a final, desperate push, we burst through the doorway, collapsing onto the stone floor of the main cavern. The whispers ceased immediately, as though cut off by an invisible barrier. The shadows did not follow. I lay there, gasping for air, my body trembling with adrenaline. We were out, but I knew deep down that the nightmare wasn't over. That place, the books, the voices, the shadows, it wasn't done with us yet. And whatever we had disturbed in that ancient library, it wanted us back. Bea's question hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The idea that this place was a catalog of every sin ever committed and yet to be was absurd. But after everything we had seen, it was hard to shake off the creeping possibility that Grant had been right. The thought made my skin crawl, the idea that something, somewhere, had been keeping tabs on our darkest secrets, even the ones we hadn't acted upon yet. It was too much to process. As we walked in silence, the wire our only guide, I couldn't help but replay Grant's final moments in my mind. The way he had looked at us, with that manic grin, the insane laughter, and the absolute conviction that this place held every wrong he'd ever done. His sudden leap over the ledge felt less like an act of despair and more like a surrender, like he was giving himself up to something we couldn't understand. I glanced over at Bea. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell she was still shaken by everything. We all were. The soldiers, too, had grown even more tense, their rifles clutched tightly in their hands, their eyes darting between the towering shelves. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It felt thick and oppressive, like we were walking through a dream where sound didn't exist. Meikle kept checking his compass, but every time he glanced down at it, his expression darkened. He didn't trust it anymore, and honestly, neither did I. This place had a way of messing with everything, our sense of direction, our sense of time. Hell, I wasn't even sure how long we'd been down there anymore. It felt like hours, maybe even days. But we had only planned to stay for 6 hours, tops. How far do you think we are from the exit? I asked, more to break the silence than anything else. B shrugged. Hard to say, but the wire's still holding, so that's a good sign, right? None of the soldiers responded, but I could tell they were as doubtful as I was. The wire was our only lifeline, but there was no shaking the nagging feeling that it could lead us in circles forever. This place wanted it, too. After what felt like another hour of walking, we came to a section of the cave that was different from the rest. The shelves here were shorter, almost like they had been broken off, and the books piled atop them were haphazardly strewn about, as if someone or something had been rifling through them. Some of the volumes had crumbled into dust, leaving nothing but disintegrated paper and the faint smell of decay in the air. I don't like this, Baker muttered under his breath, his grip on his rifle tightening. No one does, Miko replied, but we keep moving. We're not far now, but I could feel it, the sense of being watched. It was back, stronger than ever. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping across the darkened shelves. At first I saw nothing, just the towering walls of books and ancient stone. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something small darting between the shelves. What the hell was that? I whispered, trying to steady my breathing. Miko glanced back at me. What did you see? I don't know. Something moved. I think the soldiers turned their lights in the direction I had pointed, but there was nothing there, just the empty, endless rows of books. Let's keep going, Bea said, her voice shaking just a little. We're almost out. We have to be. We pushed forward, our pace quickening despite the exhaustion weighing on us. But the feeling of being followed never left. In fact, it grew worse with every step we took. I could hear the faint sound of something moving behind us, skittering across the stone floor, like claws tapping lightly against the rock. I tried not to look back, but it was impossible to resist. And that's when I saw them, the shadows. They were back, gliding silently between the shelves, keeping just out of reach of our flashlights. Their forms were tall and elongated, more defined than before, and this time they weren't alone. There were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds. Each one seemed to move with purpose, like they were hurting us, pushing us deeper into the labyrinth. Pick up the pace. Miko barked, his voice cracking with fear. We started jogging, then running, the wire bouncing behind us as we clung to it for dear life. The shadows followed, their movements fluid and unnatural, almost as if they were slipping through the cracks of reality itself. I could hear Bea's ragged breathing beside me, and the soldiers' boots pounding against the ground as we raced toward what we hoped was the exit. But the shadows weren't letting up, they were closing in, faster now, their shapes becoming clearer. I could see faces twisted, contorted faces within the dark, eyes that glowed faintly, mouths that gaped open as if to scream, but made no sound. They reached out for us, their long, bony fingers stretching impossibly far, and then, just as I thought we wouldn't make it, we burst into a wide, open chamber. The wire led us straight to it, and at the far end I could see the faint glow of daylight spilling in from the entrance. We were almost out, but the shadows didn't stop. They followed us into the chamber, their pace slowing as they neared the light, but they didn't disappear. They hovered just at the edges, as if the sunlight repelled them but couldn't drive them away completely. Go, Miko shouted, waving us forward. Get out. Nah, we didn't need to be told twice. One by one, we sprinted toward the exit, the cold, fresh air hitting my face like a slap. I stumbled out into the open, gasping for breath, the weight of the underground finally lifting from my shoulders. The last to emerge were the soldiers, dragging a dazed and barely conscious Dr. Rosenstein with them. As soon as we were all out, Mikkel turned and slammed the heavy metal door shut behind us, sealing the horrors of the library away. We stood there in silence, panting, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, but none of them were like the ones inside. These were normal shadows, the kind we could live with. For a long time, no one spoke. We were too shaken, too rattled by what we had just experienced. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back in there. None of us were. Whatever had happened down in that labyrinth, whatever those folks and those shadows were, we had only scratched the surface, and the deeper truth of one we had all feared but refused to acknowledge was that we hadn't escaped. Not really, because whatever we had disturbed down there, it had followed us. We ran, stumbling over the uneven ground as panic overtook us. The sound of the wall grinding behind us only grew louder, like it was chasing us down, gaining speed with every second. I couldn't shake the image of the young soldier's face, eyes wide in shock, mouth opening in a silent scream as he was crushed beneath that impossible, moving structure. Blood everywhere, his body contorting, bones snapping like dry twigs under the weight of the advancing wall. I don't remember much from those next few moments. Adrenaline and fear blurred my senses. All I knew was that I needed to move fast. The wire that had once seemed like a lifeline to the outside world now felt like a sick joke, snaking through the darkness towards an end that none of us could understand. Bee was still somewhere ahead, and Williams had bolted after her. The rest of us ran blindly, guided only by instinct and the primal need to survive. Move faster. Mikkel's voice was rough, edged with fear as he urged us on. I glanced back briefly and saw the wall continuing its relentless push forward, seeming almost alive in its grotesque movement. There was no time to think, only to run. The corridor ahead of us narrowed, and the oppressive feeling of being trapped grew with every step. I could hear Bee's distant screams, sharp and panicked, echoing back toward us. And then, suddenly, we burst into an open space of vast chamber that seemed impossibly large given the claustrophobic tunnel we'd just escaped from. It was filled with towering columns, each one covered in more books, more endless records of sins written in languages I couldn't even begin to comprehend. But it wasn't the books that held my attention. At the far end of the chamber, a figure stood, tall and gaunt, draped in dark, tattered robes that seemed to absorb the light from our flashlights. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its gaze, a cold, searing presence that pinned us in place. Bee was on the ground a few feet from the figure, clutching her head, her sobs racking her body. Williams had stopped just short of her, frozen in fear. The rest of us slowed to a halt, unwilling to get any closer to whatever this thing was. "What the hell is that?" Mikkel whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. The figure didn't move, but I could hear something. A low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate in the air around us. It grew louder, filling the chamber with a deep, bone-shaking resonance. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing ragged as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. Then, without warning, the figure raised a hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, and with it came a wave of darkness that seemed to ripple through the air. It wasn't a shadow, it was something far worse. It swallowed the light from our flashlights, consumed the air around us, and with it came a crushing sense of despair that weighed down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I felt myself falling to my knees, my strength sapped from my body. The others were in the same state, Bee still sobbing, William standing rigid, Miko muttering under his breath like he was trying to pray, but had forgotten how and then the voice came, not from the figure, but from all around us. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to resonate from the walls, from the books, from the very air we breathed. "You are not welcome here." The words slithered into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. It was a sensation unlike anything I had ever experienced, as if the voice had crawled into my thoughts and taken root there, twisting and turning like a living thing. "Your sins are not yet written." The figure took a step toward us, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. I tried to scream, too shot to move, but my body refused to obey. The weight of the darkness was too much. "Leave, or your sins will be recorded before their time." The grinding noise from the corridor returned, louder now, and I realized with a sickening clarity that the wall had reached the chamber. The others must have noticed it, too, because Miko finally broke free from his paralysis, grabbing my arm and pulling me up to my feet. "Go," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. We didn't need to be told twice. William scooped up B, who had gone completely limp, and we sprinted toward the far end of the chamber, away from the figure, away from the advancing wall, away from the horrors that had trapped us in this nightmare. As we ran, the ground beneath us seemed to shift and warp, like the entire place was coming alive, trying to keep us trapped. The walls groaned and creaked, the ceiling above us shedding dust and debris as it seemed to close in on us. We reached the far side of the chamber, where another corridor waited. It was narrow and dark, but it was the only way out. Without hesitation, we plunged into it, the sound of the grinding wall and the droning hum fading behind us. But I knew deep down that we hadn't escaped. Not really. The figure's words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of what awaited us if we stayed. "Your sins are not yet written, but they would be. If we ever made it out of here alive, they would be." I bolted, heart hammering in my chest, the light of the torch bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the corridor. I could still hear Miko's desperate screams behind me, each one punctuated by a sickening crunch of bones being broken. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. The only thing I knew was that I needed to survive. And the further I got from that thing, the better my chances. The heads on the shelves watched silently as I ran past, their whispers drowned out by the pounding of my own footsteps. The corridor seemed endless, stretching into darkness, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I was running on pure adrenaline, and even as the muscles in my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were about to give out, I kept going. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a larger chamber, the air thick and stale, but the ground mercifully stable beneath my feet. I collapsed against a stone wall, gasping for breath, my body screaming for rest. For a moment, I let myself believe I had escaped, that I was safe, but that was a lie. The chamber was massive, lit by an unnatural light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls were lined with grotesque statues, all twisted into forms that were barely recognizable as human, each one more disturbing than the last. And in the center of the room there was a massive pit, a black void that seemed to devour the light around it. I stared at it, unable to tear my eyes away. Something was in there, lurking in the darkness. I could feel its presence, a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was waiting for me, watching me. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed by fear, as the sound of something slithering echoed from the pit. A low, guttural growl followed, vibrating through the chamber and deep into my bones. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my side, and I cried out, clutching my ribs. When I looked down, I saw thin red lines snaking up from my skin, as if the very air was cutting into me. The pain intensified, and I knew I had to get out of there. I had to keep moving, using the wall for support. I pushed myself to my feet. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to walk, my legs trembling beneath me. I scanned the room for an exit, but there was nothing. No doors, no hallways, just the pit, and the statues, and the crushing sense of dread that filled the space. The slithering grew louder, closer, and I knew that whatever was in that pit wasn't going to wait much longer. I stumbled forward, desperate to find some way out, when I noticed something strange. One of the statues was different from the others. It wasn't contorted in pain or terror like the rest. It was standing tall, proud, with its arms outstretched as if it was beckoning me. For reasons I couldn't explain, I moved toward it. My body moved on its own, ignoring the pain and the exhaustion. When I reached the statue, I realized that it wasn't a statue at all. It was a door, a hidden passage carved into the stone, disguised to blend in with the grotesque figures around it. Without thinking, I pushed against it, and the stone gave way with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow passage beyond. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed through the opening and found myself in another corridor, this one much smaller and darker than the one I had just left. I could still hear the creature behind me, the slithering growing distant, but never disappearing entirely. But I knew I had bought myself some time, maybe just a few minutes, maybe more, but it was enough to keep going. The passage was tight, forcing me to crouch as I moved. The walls were wet, slick with something that smelled like rot, and the air was so thick with moisture that it felt like I was drowning with every breath. But I kept moving, the torch flickering weakly in my hand. As I rounded a corner, the passage suddenly opened up into another small chamber, this one empty except for a single figure standing in the center. It was Chris. He stood there, his back to me, facing the far wall. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and sickly, but it was unmistakably him. Relief flooded through me, and I rushed forward, calling his name. Chris, Chris, it's me. He didn't move. I slowed down, dread creeping back in as I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but the moment my fingers brushed his skin, he turned his face. His face wasn't Chris's. It was twisted, warped beyond recognition. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that split his face in two. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and something moved beneath his skin, writhing just beneath the surface. I stumbled back, heart racing as the figure let out a low, guttural laugh. Chris is gone, it said, its voice distorted and echoing in the chamber. There's only us now. Before I could react, it lunged at me, its hands clawing at my throat. I barely managed to duck out of the way, scrambling backward as the thing that had once been Chris advanced on me. I was trapped, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this time. The emptiness of the space where my eyes once were sank in, like a void opening within my chest. I couldn't cry, not anymore. All I could do was sit there, my fingers trembling against the roughness of the bandages, and think about that note. Best wishes, me. I don't know what hurt more, my blindness, or the fact that the creature responsible for everything had sent us back like damaged goods. An afterthought in its twisted game. Time moved strangely after that. I drifted in and out of awareness, relying on the sterile sounds of the hospital to orient myself. The beep of machines, the murmurs of nurses, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. I was never alone, yet I felt more isolated than I had ever been in my life. The others, the survivors, were lost in their own worlds of pain and madness. Bee's screams echoed down the halls, her voice hoarse and ragged from days of endless wailing. She hadn't stopped since the moment we returned. There was no peace for her, no relief. I think she was reliving that final moment, the crunch of her skull and that monster's hand over and over again. It was a mercy, they said, to sedate her. But nothing could erase the sound of her broken sobs from my mind. The soldier who was dragged into the shelves never woke up. They said his brain activity was minimal, a shadow of what it should have been. The doctors were baffled. He was physically fine, but something had hollowed him out, left him an empty shell. Grant, he scribbled all day, all night, anything he could find, a wall, a sheet. His own skin became his canvas. Words of sin, phrases that made no sense to anyone else but him. They had to restrain him after he started carving letters into his arms with a shard of broken glass. As for Mikkel, well, he was the hardest to face. I knew the hatred he harbored toward me was justified. I had abandoned him, and though I hadn't pulled the trigger, it was my inaction that had sealed his fate in that dark, terrible corridor. The fact that he'd been returned, like the rest of us, only to have his memories intact, was a cruel twist. I often wonder if it would have been kinder to let him die there. Maybe that was the real punishment, to be sent back with the knowledge that none of us were ever supposed to survive. I spent hours, days maybe, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. But without sight, all I could do was replay the sounds, the smells, the sensations in my mind. I'd feel the grip of that old man's hand on my shoulder, the heat radiating from him as he helped me. I'd remember the way the air tasted of ash and burnt skin in that place, how the walls seemed to pulse with a sick, living rhythm. The voice of the creature, the one with the hands like branches and a face full of writhing fingers, haunted me. And the worst part, there was no way out of the memories, no distraction, nothing to pull me from the endless loop of horror that played in my mind. I was trapped just like we had been in that infernal labyrinth. Only now the prison was my own mind. Months passed, and though the physical wounds healed, the mental scars never faded. The doctors tried their best to help, but how could they treat something that defied explanation? How could they understand what we had seen, what we had been through? They chalked it up to trauma, to delusions brought on by stress and exhaustion. But I knew better. We had seen hell, and hell had seen us. Sometimes, late at night, when the hospital was at its quietest, I would feel something watching me. Not the nurses, not the doctors. Something else, something from that place. It was as if a part of me had never left, as if a piece of that dark world had latched onto my soul, a parasite feeding on my despair. And then there were the whispers, soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder as the days dragged on. They came from the corners of the room, from the shadowed places just beyond my reach. They spoke of sin, of judgment, of eternal damnation. They weren't in any language I understood, yet I knew exactly what they meant. I didn't tell anyone about them. I couldn't. Who would believe me? They'd think I'd finally lost it, that I was no different from B or Grant. So I kept the whispers to myself, even as they crept closer and closer, until it felt like they were right next to me, breathing down my neck. One night, as I lay awake in the dark, the whispers grew so loud that I could barely hear my own thoughts. My heart raced, my skin crawled, and then silence, total, oppressive silence. I strained to listen, to figure out what had changed, and that's when I felt it, a hand, cold and clammy, resting on my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I knew that hand. I'd felt it before. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew. The old man, the one who had helped me, had never really left, and in that moment I understood one final, terrible truth. You don't just walk away from hell. Hell follows you, and I would never be free.